So a watershed is the area of land where all of the water that drains off of it goes into the same place. Now, this is a refresher for most of you, but I thought we'd all start with sort of the same basic information because we've invited lots of different types of people to this event. Watersheds exist at different geographic scales. For example, when we host the Symposium at United Way of Greater Houston in previous years, we would all have been located in the Buffalo Bayou watershed. But all of us are at the same time in the much larger Galveston Bay watershed. So you can have watersheds at small scales and at much larger scales. A watershed can look a lot like a leaf, each stream a vein in the leaf. The importance of all our bayous, the most notable feature of our region's landscape, is the connection between our urban and rural areas to the bay and the Gulf through those watersheds and waterways. We find watersheds everywhere. All land is part of a watershed. Since you're here today, you most likely already know which watershed you live in, but if you don't know, it's easy to find out. There are tools available on our website that link you to some tools from our partners that can help you type in your address and your zip code, and you can find out exactly what watershed you live in or what watershed you work in. But most of us attending today live in a watershed that drains into Galveston Bay. We're all more connected than you think. Because every single person lives in a watershed everywhere on Earth, watershed condition is important to everyone and everything that uses and needs water. Bayous are a most visible sign in Houston of our region's watersheds. Healthy watersheds provide critical services such as clean drinking water, productive fisheries, and outdoor recreation, and they can also support our economies, environment, and quality of life. The health of clean waters is heavily influenced by the condition of their surrounding watersheds, mainly because pollutants can wash off from the land to the water and cause substantial harm. No matter where you live, when it rains, it all eventually ends up flowing into our bayous, creeks, and streams, and eventually into Galveston Bay. And when I talk to youth groups or general community groups, people are sometimes surprised that when it rains, the water that washes off our streets into the storm drains isn't clean. It just goes straight into our waterways. And so that's just such an important piece of information to pass along. So in addition to our annual educational symposium, Bayou Preservation Association has 4 major program areas that help us steward our bayous. We have, and they focus on addressing a couple of our strategic goals to increase understanding and to increase stewardship of our bayous. And we have the tagline Bayou CPR, and that stands for our mission of celebrating, protecting, and restoring. So each of our programs is supported by an active committee of regional stakeholders. We are actively seeking enthusiastic volunteers to help us with all of our programs. So our first program area is Bayou Appreciation. We support the Bayou paddling trails, and we're working on developing Bayou walking adventures, guided paddle trips, and informational materials such as interpretive signs. Another program area is our Bayou Citizen Science program, where we work with Texas Stream Team data monitors. We have targeted bacteria sampling, and we try to inform citizens for action. We partner and collaborate with many organizations, agencies, individuals, and businesses to carry out our programs. In our Bayou Citizen Science program, we're currently supporting 4 Texas Stream Team volunteer citizen scientists as they conduct monthly monitoring at 6 separate sites along Sims and White Oak bayous. We're actively looking to expand the number of citizen scientists, so give me a call if you're interested. We endeavor to partner with organizations like the Student Conservation Association and American Youth Works to provide conservation-related job experience when seeing out our initiatives. For our stream corridor restoration program, we have hosted several young adult and youth crews recently at our Clear Creek riparian restoration project at Challenger 7 Memorial Park, and are gearing up to start a targeted bacteria sampling project with student interns on some of the most bacteria-impaired waterways in our region. One aspect of our stream corridor restoration project is invasive plant species removal and vegetation management services, trying to have healthy riparian corridors. The overarching goal of our trash-free bayous program is reducing trash in the region's waterways through bayou cleanups and prevention strategies. People need to remember that trash pollutes our bayous. Anything thrown into the streets gets washed away into a storm drain, then ends up in one of our bayous and possibly the Gulf of Mexico. The Trash-Free Bayous program supports Bayou Preservation Association's stewardship goal to increase stewardship and stewardship opportunities to improve the health of our watersheds, creeks, and bayous. And it also supports our education outreach goal of increasing understanding of area bayous, creeks, and watersheds. Of all of our programs, we see that our largest number of volunteers seeking projects that remove litter and plastics from our watersheds before they end up in the bayous. It's just a really visible sign of water quality that folks can really get enthusiastic about. So we also work on public policy initiatives. We have an art car and we have committees. We have lots of volunteer opportunities. We're always seeking volunteers to help us with environmental education, for our trash bash events and other outreach events, and we have a training program for that. We're always looking for folks to get involved with our bayou themed art car for the art car parade. We seek volunteers to be informed about invasive species work days where we are doing habitat restoration at sites such as Challenger 7 Memorial Park or other bayous in our region. And we're always looking for volunteers for behind the scenes, looking for digital ambassadors and those just a lot of fun activities you can do with us. So our next event is our annual gala, 20 Reasons to Celebrate Our Bayous in 2020, where we'll look back on 20 years of festive fetes in support of our organization. You can learn more about that on our website if you're interested. So we feel like every single person in our region, in the Galveston Bay watershed and the greater Houston Galveston area is essentially a member of Bayou Preservation Association because we all are impacted by the waterways and watersheds, and everyone has a vested stake in this organization's mission. So Chris, I'm going to turn it back to you, and I just want to, before I turn it back to you, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining today and thank our symposium sponsors, our presenting sponsor, Houston Galveston Area Council, and a special thank you goes to our committee members, and especially Chris Brown, our moderator, and then other committee members, Todd Running, Carolyn White, Robert Rayburn, Mary Talley, Elaine Savage, Danielle Cioci, Carol LaBreche, and our committee chair, Becky Olive. And last but not least, I wanted to say thank you to the team making this event happen behind the scenes. At Bayou Preservation, we have Annie Rank, and at HGAC, Andrea Tantillo and Kathy Jansen. Back to you, Chris.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate that introduction and you saying those kind words. Becky Olive is our chairperson, and we could not do all of this without her leadership for these many years. We really appreciate Becky. So I believe that what I will do right now is test some of our polling questions, and I'm going to put these up on the screen. You're going to be able to select answers, and we can begin to tally these results. And we'd like to learn a little bit about all of you that are here today. So one of the first things I think we're going to do is just ask how many of you maybe have attended a symposium in the past. So go ahead and click on your answer there. And as the results come in, when I end it, you're going to see the results. So keep voting. So almost finished. I can see how many responses are being collected from all of y'all that are attending. And I have been involved. This is how I originally got involved in the Bayou Preservation Association. Sarah was mentioning the committees that we have. The symposium committee was how I joined the organization over 10 years ago now. And I've certainly gotten a lot out of everything that I have contributed to the organization. And I certainly have learned a lot more about our region and its bayous. So looks like we've probably collected everything. See here. Wanted to show you the results. There they are. So we have a lot of first timers. Well, welcome everybody. And for those of you that attended them all, 17 years of them, congratulations. I think I'm getting pretty close there myself, but wonderful to have so many repeat guests. And I hope that that means that we have been showing you a lot of great content over these years. So let's get to our first presenter this morning, which is our special welcome, who's coming from Rodney Franklin, director of our state parks at Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. Rodney's practically a lifer. He's managed multiple park sites over the years, been regional director in multiple locations of the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, a division director, deputy division director, as a matter of fact. And I met Rodney at the State Parks Advisory Committee, and am really proud to have somebody have risen through the ranks, because he really understands all the aspects of our park system. And Rodney is our special welcome this morning, so I will turn it over to him. Waiting for Rodney to appear. There he is. Good morning, Rodney.
Good morning. How are you, Chris? Good to see you.
Wonderful. Good to see you as well.
It's good to be here, and I'm going to pull up my presentation, make sure we're all good to go, and hopefully everybody can see that. All right. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to this wonderful group. It's really good to be here. It's always good to be in the same virtual room, I will say, as folks that are involved in conservation and preservation. And I really appreciate the words Sarah used, talking, and you, Chris, also talking about diversity, talking about celebrating and the preservation work that we do. So it is all related, and we are all working for the same goal. So it's always good to be in a room full of folks, even virtually, that have those same conservation mindsets and those same goals in mind. So thanks for inviting me here. My name is Rodney Franklin, and normally this would be the part of the presentation where I ask how many of y'all have been to a state park. And I can't see you raising your hands, but in my heart, mind, and soul, I feel like you are all raising your hands. You've been to a state park or a wildlife management area. Certainly, the Houston area is full of diversity.
Rodney, we're going to ask you, we can see if you could just do your presentation view of your slideshow so the slides get a little bit bigger for everybody.
Okay, gotcha. Hold on, let me.
There we go.
That no good. Let's see. Let me see. I thought that is not presentation view.
Rodney, no worries. If you see where it says display settings with a little triangle, if you'll click on that, at the very top, display settings.
Oh yeah,
right there. Now, if you'll swap presenter view and slideshow, and we should see it flip here in just a moment. There we go. Thanks so much.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you, Kathy.
I was looking. We switched screens. I'm with you now. Is that better?
Much better. Thanks, Rodney.
Okay, you bet. All right. Thank y'all. So again, as I was saying, I'm sure everybody that I'm speaking to today has been to a state park, and you can put your favorite park in the chat if you like, and we can discuss that a little bit later. This first slide, of course, speaks to the topics that we're visiting about today, because when you talk about diversity, that is an all-encompassing word, and you can see the diversity of activity and the diversity of folks that we have in this first slide here, and the diversity of landscape. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that today. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, not much. Chris did a great job of introducing me, and I do have quite a bit of time with the state park system. I've been working for nearly 30 years. I'm still amazed that they allowed a 12-year-old to work for a state park and get paid, but you know, it is what it is. But nearly 30 years with parks. I've worked at some of the most beautiful places in the state. So I'm really proud, and this is, you know, part of who I am. So I want to talk a little bit about the Texas Parks and Wildlife Mission, which you've all have seen most likely before, but I wanted to point out 3 words in our mission: conserve, resources, and future, because that ties into what we'll be talking about today. Why diversity is important, why it's good for us to restore and protect these landscapes and special places in the state of Texas. So a little bit about Texas Parks and Wildlife. I wanted to make sure that while I work for the State Parks Division, I am part of a bigger community, a bigger family of Texas Parks and Wildlife professionals that are all tied to the important work of conservation. Nearly 640,000 acres of state park land, 88 state parks across Texas. We have 50 WMAs. But what's important on the wildlife management side, some of the work that our professional wildlife technicians do, they also work with a lot of private landowners. So we have wildlife management plans that cover about 30 million acres of private land. So that's a key part to what we do too, because you all know that 95% of Texas is privately owned. So we have to work with folks that help us meet our mission in the landscapes across Texas. And then just we have over 1,300 miles of formal trails to allow the effective use of some of our landscapes, and that includes 56 miles of paddling trails. So when we talk about the word diversity, I want to talk about what that means a little bit. We have diversity of landscape. You've all heard the old adage that Texas is like a whole nother country. Texas ranks second only to California in the overall biodiversity in the state. So that means from the West Texas mountains and deserts to the piney woods east and the Gulf Coast, we have estuaries, bays, rivers, and streams. You have a little bit of everything across the state of Texas. 6,000 different species varieties that you will see in our native landscape. 425 of those at least are just endemic to Texas. So we have a lot of diversity in the state and a lot of places for people to enjoy. We also have a diverse population and a diversity of people that enjoy those landscapes. And that's important too, and it plays into how we effectively care for these sites and will care for these sites into the future. We cannot ignore, while we protect the diversity of our landscapes and our ecoregions and our ecosystems and our biodiversity is very critical, important, because as you look at the web of life, that any piece of that is disturbed affects the other part of it. And so the diversity of people is much the same way. We have to engage all the populations of Texas to help us meet our mission. And then we have a diversity of activity, which is one of my favorite things in state parks. There's interest for every person, whether you like horseback riding or you just like hiking in nature, as we saw in the earlier photo. And then you can do all of those things in a variety of landscapes across Texas, which is absolutely crucial and critical to do. So very important. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of what you can see in the Houston area. The Galveston Bay area is rich with diversity and is very important ecosystem, and we are in charge of managing and taking care of some of that. See, I'm sure a lot of y'all maybe have listed Brazos Bend as your favorite state park, but we also have Sheldon Lake State Park and Education Center. So we have some beautiful areas there in the Houston region as well. I know that you'll have a lot of speakers that have PhDs, and we'll talk about a lot of the science behind what we do, which is important. Just wanted y'all to know I'm going to be showing a lot of pretty pictures today because when it comes to state parks and it comes to seeing the landscapes that we have across Texas, the diversity that exists in the state is crucial. It's part of what makes Texas special, and it's part of why I love this state so much. And some of the things you can see across Texas in the bayous and estuaries. Some of the things you can see in our state parks, these photos were taken in a state park, are very crucial and important. And we'll talk about why that's important a little bit later. So not only state parks, we also have our wildlife management areas also that play a critical role in preserving the habitat that is so crucial to the state of Texas. But this is one of my favorite pictures too, because it also speaks to the responsible use that is important. Be easy to have all of this special and unique gems across Texas behind a locked gate where nobody could ever see them and enjoy them. But that's not what Texas is all about, and that's not what the mission of Texas Parks and Wildlife is all about. And certainly, I know that the folks on the virtual webinar here understand that we have to have responsible, sustainable usage of these special places as well. So it is important to provide an outlet for folks. So it's important to provide recreational use, but that also comes with some challenges to make sure that we are doing everything we can to protect these resources, which is why I thought this theme that Chris spoke about of celebrating our diversity, but celebrating what we do to protect and restore is very important, because the work that we do and with partners like you all, we have to preserve these natural places, because as you saw in our mission statement, we're doing this for future generations. So how do we do that? We do it with help. I was glad to hear Sarah mention the American Youth Works, Texas Conservation Corps, because they are crucial to helping us meet the mission of protecting these very special places in Texas, because we could not do it on our own. But also it helps cultivate a conservation mindset for the next generation. And if we don't do that, the work that we're doing today will be lost tomorrow, because we need those future stewards to help us protect these special places. So why do we do this? As I just mentioned, a couple of things I want to talk about that's important to us and that we are thinking about, certainly was mentioned earlier on the conference. Texas population is growing. Texas urbanization is growing. And the demographics of Texas is shifting. We all know that. The demand for outdoor spaces is absolutely growing. And over the last few months, that has been shown to me without a doubt. Folks have been clamoring and needing and wanting to get outside more and more. And we have new folks that maybe weren't engaged in the outdoors that realize the importance of nature and the importance of the being able to get outside. So it just really solidified the fact that the work that we're doing to preserve and restore some of our natural habitat is absolutely crucial, because once it's lost, some of it may be lost forever. So with all these things in mind, let's take a look at where Houstonians are spending some time, at least at state parks. I mentioned Brazos Bend, and I know this is probably a little bit hard for y'all to see, but the biggest takeaway there is that at Brazos Bend State Park, over 135,000 Houstonians, folks from the Houston area, visit that park. That's the big green part of that pie, which is 90% of the visitation at Brazos Bend comes from the Houston area. And so that is an important stat. And the other thing is over half of the visitors to state parks in Texas, well over 3 million visitors to state parks, come from urban areas. So that we have a lot that come from non-urban areas and rural areas. But with that in mind, that more and more of our urban population wanting to get outside, with over 3 million of them visiting state parks, we have to keep that in mind as we plan the next series of state parks and public lands. Why is it important? That's the question I ask. There's no doubt that it's better for the health and well-being of Texans Folks have seen that very much during the pandemic. It's good for your physical, mental well-being. Just walking in nature lowers blood pressure. It improves your mood. I think that everyone here knows that there's a restorative power to nature, which is another reason the theme of this symposium is important, because there's not only the need to restore our natural landscapes, but there's a restorative power to the heart, mind, body, and soul of human beings. So that's why that is important, and that's why we have to preserve these places for the future. There's also money involved, right? It's important to note that the impact, economic impact of state parks just on the economy of Texas is almost $900 million. Through user fees and folks getting outside, we make back about half of what we invest in state parks. So it's a good investment to have, actually. And then also just the cost of replacement. The cost of wetlands is something that should be noted, because once we lose those, if we have to have these replaced, it costs money. So that makes us very much attuned to keeping these wetlands preserved to begin with. Because when you look at a cost of potentially millions of dollars to replace what is lost, that is critical, and they play such a critical role. Wetlands, and bayous, and marshes play such a critical role in flood protection, and they play a critical role in our biodiversity. They are home to hundreds and thousands of species of birds, and they play a role in our commercial fishing, our recreational fishing. All of those things have dollars associated with them, and our wetlands and our native habitat play a role in that. So there's an economic component to this as well that needs to be thought about, and certainly is planned when we as conservation professionals think about our role in this. But to me, this slide represents the most important reason why we have to preserve and protect these special places. Absolutely critical for the future generations. This slide is one of my favorite slides. It's one of my favorite photos, actually. And I will find a way, no matter what I'm talking about, even if I'm happen to be talking about snowboarding, I'm going to find a way to put this slide in that presentation, because it's absolutely one of my favorite photos. If you've ever had the opportunity to see a child catch their first fish, it's something you will never forget, and it is the excitement and the glow that comes from that is why I do what I do, and it's what continues to drive me to make sure parks are protected and welcoming to everyone. Because this young lady needs to work for Texas Parks and Wildlife someday, and it needs to be the person that's protecting our bayous someday. And so the way to do that is to connect this young lady to the outdoors as early as possible. And young boys and girls just like her across the state have to be connected from an early age. And that the reason for that is because these smiles will be the next stewards. So part of what we do, and the reason we do it, is to create these future stewards. So as I wrap up, I'm gonna move through the next few slides fairly quickly. I just wanted to let you know what's on the horizon for the state of Texas and state parks and Texas Parks and Wildlife. We're gonna continue to leverage our partnerships. We work with folks like the Bayou Preservation Association. We work with the Texas Conservation Corps. We work with communities across Texas to get the important work of conservation done each year. So we're going to continue to do that. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about and show my appreciation to each of you for voting in November, last November, for the constitutional amendment to dedicate sporting goods sales tax to state parks and historic sites. That is absolutely critical for the future sustainability of protecting our state parks. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to mention that. And then just recently, the Great American Outdoors Act all of these things show the support for conservation and support for the mission of protecting these special places moving forward. And we're going to continue to do that. And then for state parks, we have a few opportunities that are coming up in the future, most notably Palo Pinto Mountains State Park. This is a picture of some of the work we'll be doing at Devil's River out in the west, which is absolutely a critical and crucial habitat. So we're going to do, we're planning right now and doing some things to make sure that we have responsible usage of that very pristine habitat. And that's why the professionals that are working for Texas Parks and Wildlife and the professionals that we work with and associations are critical to providing us feedback to help us do that in a responsible way. Palo Pinto Mountain's excited about that, 75 miles west of Dallas-Fort Worth area, right in between Dallas-Fort Worth and Abilene. It's going to be an absolutely beautiful park. Planning is happening right now, but also the design work, and we're going to start letting contracts this fall, hopefully to be doing a ribbon cutting in the 100-year celebration of state parks coming up in 2023. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Very excited about Palo Pinto Mountain. Work is about to be underway on that state park outside the Dallas area very soon. And then we have Powderhorn, which is going to do a great job at helping us protect some habitat in our coastal Matagorda Bay area. Very excited about that. So that one's on the list as well. We're planning and designing, doing some planning work for that particular property too. It's got a wildlife management area on it and a state park on it as well. So as I wrap up here, just wanted to really reiterate the theme of this being the work that we do being important, because in the protecting these special places, I know that I won't be able to do it forever. As many of us that are on this call will do it as long as we can, but we have to create the next generation of stewards. So we have to connect all Texans, because of the demographics of Texans is changing. We have to connect all Texans, young and old, to outdoors right now, because we have a responsibility to leave this land better for our children and our grandchildren than it is for us. We have that responsibility. I live that theme, and that means the work we're doing today, the outreach we're doing today to create that diversity will preserve that diversity in the future. And the reason we do that is because we all know that life's better outside. So with that, I will end my time. I hope I didn't go over too much with the glitch at the beginning, but I appreciate y'all having me today. I appreciate being able to share something that I'm really passionate about, and it's always good to visit with people who feel the same way. So enjoy the rest of your symposium. Welcome to your symposium. You've got some great speakers lined up, and I appreciate being a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rodney. You've had the sun rising over your head all morning while you've been doing your presentation. it's great.
Oh, well, it probably, I hope it didn't distract y'all too much. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. And thank you for mentioning once again the upcoming anniversary, the 100-year anniversary of our state park system in just 3 short years. So thank you very much for being here and for your remarks this morning. We're going to roll right on into our next presenter, our first presenter actually. So Eric Muncher is here with us this morning. He is a regional scientist and project manager with SWCA Environmental, and we brought him in today because he is director of a wonderful group, the Turtle Survival Alliance. We've been calling him the Turtle Guy as we've been doing our the symposium. But very proud to have Eric with us this morning. So take it away, sir.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate you guys inviting me. Can you see my screen?
Yes, indeed. Looks great.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, great. I really appreciate being a part of this. It really allows us to bring to light a really special animal that we have found in the midst of Houston, Texas. It's become a passion research project for me. I never thought I would get to work with this particular species. It is an iconic freshwater turtle species throughout the world. is the largest freshwater turtle species in the United States. And what I will be doing with this presentation going forward is just giving a little overview of the animal itself, its ecology, its history, and why is it important that we found it within Buffalo Bayou in Houston, Texas. So, progress this. Okay. Okay. So this is the western alligator snapping turtle. It is known from Florida to basically Harris County, is the furthest southwestern extent of this animal's range. It is the largest hard-shelled turtle in the United States, and actually it is one of the largest hard-shelled turtles in the world. Historic size ranges put up to over 200 pounds. Our largest turtle we have captured so far in Houston is 132 pounds. Females and males are sexually dimorphic, which means one sex gets bigger than the other. In turtles, it's typically the female. The female has to build up all of her eggs inside, so she needs more room. With this particular species, that's not the case. The male gets a lot larger than the female, and that's simply because he will have to defend habitat from other males and defend females from other males, where he might have several females in an area that he calls home, and he only wants them to himself. They are known in parts of the range as the loggerhead turtle. You can see these two individuals are actually two adult males. The one on the cursor is pointing to now was a little over 90 pounds, and this one was just a little bit over 70 pounds. They were caught in the same trap. Slot turtle to handle. They're known for their large heads. They are regarded as a snapping turtle. A lot of people confuse them with the common or eastern snapping turtle, which is a smaller species of snapping turtle in the United States. That one is far more aggressive and actually does snap. Its neck structure is built to actually extend out in rapid movement, where this one is not. It will just sit there with its big mouth open and hoping that you make an accident and put something in its mouth and it'll crush it. They primarily feed on fish and carrion. Anecdotal things say they can live for a very, very long time. Unfortunately, with research on these species, that is not corroborated because long-term research on the species is almost non-existent. Currently, we are going on our 6th year in Buffalo Bayou, and there aren't many other species and many other studies that have gone for that long on this particular animal. Finding a 10-year study on this animal is really, really hard to find. So we don't know exactly how long they live. Turtles are extremely long-lived animals in general. Some species do live over 200 years. The Galapagos tortoises are a good example, have been documented living that long. Little box turtles can live over 100 years. So I would not doubt that the alligator snapping turtle can live over 100 years, especially with its extreme size that it can reach. They have a bite pressure that is approximately 1,000 pounds per square inch. So once again, you wouldn't want to be bitten by something like this. They are a fish specialist. They actually have a modified lure in their mouth. It's actually their tongue. They will open their mouth in the water column, and the tongue will dangle, and it looks like a worm to bring fish in. This map shows the general range that's accepted for the species. So as I mentioned, from Florida, the Suwannee River in Florida, all the way out to Harris County, Texas. This map shows going a little bit past that, but the one record out in the Brazos River is uncooperated. So currently, the furthest southwest range limit is our study in Buffalo Bayou. They are known to be riverine species, so major rivers like the Suwannee River in Florida, the Mississippi River in Texas, the Sabine, the Trinity, all have nice populations of these turtles, or should. They are known from tannic or muddy water, so you really wouldn't expect to find them in clear water habitats. They don't move too much from what's been found. They are kind of homebodies. They have established home ranges that they defend. Unlike a lot of other turtles that have extreme, that show extreme movements, these guys don't move too much. What's really important about turtles, and this is just a range map currently of the known distribution of this species in Texas. All the blue counties are counties that they have been observed and the species is known from. The orange counties are their observations, they're just not been proven, they haven't been verified. And this recent one that's in green, Montgomery County, was finally a dead individual in Spring Creek was found by our crew, and a museum record was created, and we were able to identify the species scientifically from Montgomery County. But what I was mentioning beforehand, an important thing about turtles right now is a lot of people don't realize that turtles are the #1 vertebrates, animals with a backbone, that are headed towards extinction. The vast majority of the species of turtles in the world are imperiled in some way. Critically, we currently have over 25 species that are considered functionally extinct in the wild or extirpated from their natural habitats. As you can see in some of these pictures, these are alligator snapping turtles, basically in a bit of a truck. And the problem that this is showing is poaching. Poaching for turtles worldwide is a extremely big problem for turtle survival. And it's one of the reasons why the Turtle Survival Alliance was created. Back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we had what was called the Asian turtle crisis, where in Asia you have demand for turtle meat. Large turtle species like the alligator snapping turtle is shipped to Asia for the actual meat. And if you're a smaller turtle species that might have a lot of coloration to you, or you're known to be rare, it's also a status symbol. So you're sold in the pet trade. So the issue that we have with this particular species right now is it has been harvested throughout its range, throughout history for the meat trade, and it is been impacted population-wise. A lot of the areas where people would say that they found healthy populations decades ago, turtles aren't being found anymore. If they're being found, they're smaller. You're not finding the dominant males and females that drive a population for turtles. Another big issue with this species is leftover fishing tackle. This is a fish specialist, so if there are trout lines and or fish on hooks, this turtle will come up to that and try to take the fish and inadvertently ingest the hook, and that results in unfortunate loss of the animal on most cases. This is the #1 issue that we see in Buffalo Bayou. In the 6 years that we've been doing this work, we have found 4 that have ingested fish hooks, like this poor individual here. So what's really driving conservation of the species is the demand for it overseas and the harvest. And what kind of compounds that issue is in 2014, what was once thought it was one species of alligator snapping turtle that ranged from Florida to Texas to Illinois has now been broken into 3 species of alligator snapping turtle, greatly restricting their ranges. So you can see, based off of skull morphology and shell morphology, that the 3 species that were broken out are morphologically quite different. C being the Swania alligator snapping turtle, and A being the western alligator snapping turtle. You can see quite a bit of difference between the shell morphology there. And not only that, but they were pretty substantially different genetically. So now we have 3 recognized species of this particular turtle to now have to roll out conservation efforts for population estimates for, where previously the 1 species was considered imperiled or in trouble. Now we have 3. So what happens when species like this is split up and we have more than one now? Basically, the major driving force on conservation of a species that it was one and now as many is trying to find where the ranges are and trying to find viable populations to study over time. This actual particular animal here is one of ours from Buffalo Bayou, and the one on the right of the screen is a large alligator snapping turtle from Florida. So range reductions and potential listings. What's really, really important about range reductions is trying to find viable populations and trying to look at them over time. Turtles are extremely long-lived animals. They actually are very similar to humans in that regard, in that they have what's called delayed sexual maturity, where a turtle won't become reproductive until it's 8, 10, maybe even 20 years old, depending on the species. So when you are removing large adults from a population that have reached that adulthood, that they can actually reproduce and return to the population, you're going to crash that population, because the young will take years and years and years to finally replace that adult individual. They're very different in regards to fish, where fish can reproduce extremely quickly. Turtles take a very, very long time. So, what's really interesting about our find in Buffalo Bayou, and why it really caught the turtle world off guard, and why we're so ecstatic about it, is that this is an iconic species that is known from major rivers and has never been found in an urban environment. It blew the Turtle Survival Alliance and the global turtle biologists' minds when I presented this back in 2016 to the Turtle Survival Alliance Symposium, that we're finding this in the middle of downtown Houston, where skyscrapers are, through a bayou instead of a major river drainage. And what's really important with this find is that it's not just old individuals that we're finding. We're finding a viable breeding population where we have a roughly 1-to-1 sex ratio of males to females, which is fantastic. Turtles are usually temperature sex determinate, meaning the mom and dad don't really determine the sex of the actual baby. It is based off of temperature of where the egg is incubated. So having a 1-to-1 sex ratio is really, really good, showing that there is viable nesting habitat throughout Buffalo Bayou that they're using to get adequate temperatures to make males and females. So this is a screenshot of Buffalo Bayou, basically from the ship channel all the way out until Katy. It is 53 miles long. And currently, with the study that we have started in 2016, we are really only surveying about 22 miles of it. We have found several areas that are very turtle dense that we have been trying to study, to catch as many turtles as possible. When we mark a turtle, we insert microchips into it that has a 13-digit barcode. When we catch that turtle, we wand it like you would do your dog or cat when you take them to a veterinarian. And we know that turtle. So if we catch it over time, we can tell how much it's grown, what condition it's in. So what we're seeing with that would be long-term survivability, which is really what you want when a species like this is on a poaching list. You want a population that's showing long-term survivability, that males and females are staying in the ecosystem, they're not being poached out. So what really was interesting about this find in Buffalo Bayou was that if you Google Buffalo Bayou alligator snapping turtles throughout history, you actually come up with some people who've talked about this before we found this population, and some observations over time due to floods of snapping turtles being found across Buffalo Bayou in people's pools, in people's backyards after a major flood event. And unfortunately, at times, dead ones in the bayou as well from more than likely ingested fishing tackle. So it's a species that people have seen. It's just been kind of under the radar, and it's probably why it's been doing really well in Houston. So snappers in Houston. So now that we know that they're here, our goal is to at least conduct a 10-year survey on the population of Buffalo Bayou from as far east as we can get into where Buffalo Bayou meets the ship channel, all the way out until Katy. We want to know how many there are, getting a viable population estimate for the species here. It is the only viable urban population of the species known. Since we have found them, though, there are researchers in Dallas now that have found them in the Trinity River area of Dallas, and there are researchers in Alabama that have found them going through Tuscaloosa. So it's just people weren't looking in urban settings because thinking that this species was really a riverine species and not capable of adapting to an urban setting. Our long-term goals are to see how many there are, how far these are actually moving with this atypical environment. Typically, with a river habitat, you have wetland floodplain on either side, and juveniles and adults would use that wetland floodplain occasionally. We really don't have that wetland floodplain in Buffalo Bayou. So it's really interesting to us to see how they're using this ecosystem and how far they're moving within the stream corridor. So going forward, what we plan on really doing with this research is establishing home range parameters, seeing the hot spots in Buffalo Bayou so we can help with Texas Parks and Wildlife and Bayou Preservation and other groups to see if we can conserve those habitats, those areas of Buffalo Bayou, because they're extremely important for the species. As you can see, this is shots from downtown Edith, I think it's Edith Moore Park area. It's just typically the species has a riparian zone that is heavily treed and has wetlands, and this is more manicured park in downtown Houston. But they're using it. It seems to be they're using it adequately because their population seems to be doing fairly well. In 2020, in February, we published our early findings of this study in the Urban Naturalist Journal. To date, we have caught 83 of these animals in this bayou, including 28 males, 39 females, and 16 juveniles. And that's what's really exciting to us, is that we are catching so many juveniles. They seem to be successfully breeding because of that, and hopefully within the next 4 or 5 years, we get enough data on this species to really start looking at population estimates, which has never been done in Texas for the species. And with population estimates, we can start looking at how to conserve it in other parts of the state and even in other parts of the country. The bayou itself is showing, with that turtle population, with that particular iconic species, it is shown itself to be extraordinary habitat. And a lot of people don't realize that we have this diverse and just amazing habitat in downtown Houston. We have found numerous other turtle species, including pallid spiny softshells, red-eared sliders, map turtles, cooters, and numerous fish species that will swim into our traps as well, including alligator gar. And unfortunately, we do occasionally catch invasive species. This is a armored sailfin catfish from Brazil. We have caught quite a few of them getting stuck in our nets. They're probably released from the aquarium trade. But it's showing you that the bayou system, but especially Buffalo Bayou, is viable habitat for many species. We've come across raccoon tracks, coyote tracks, otter tracks across the banks of the bayou. It's just a very diverse and very energetic ecosystem. So our focus on this species going forward is, as I mentioned earlier, finding hotspots. We want to know where the bulk of this population is spending its time, how many there are, the sex ratios. We want to collaborate with other researchers for this species on genetics. There is a big push on trying to figure out, are there only 3 of this species? Because the way the species ranges from Florida to Harris County, Texas, up to Illinois, other species within that range are river endemics, meaning that there are certain species that only occur in certain rivers. It's going to be really interesting to see if further genetic work on this animal shows that the Buffalo Bayou drainage might be a separate species, a separate subspecies. Going forward, in the next few years, we hope to have some answers of that. This is one of my favorite pictures of the whole project. This is El Gigante. He was affectionately named that as he is our biggest turtle of the project. He is a 132-pound male with a juvenile sitting on top of him. Can't imagine how old he is. Unfortunately, there's no real easy way to age turtles this size other than long-term population analysis. And hopefully we catch him again, because he was fun, and he's just an incredible animal. How to best mitigate for losses that we're seeing in Buffalo Bayou? One of the things that we would like to see would be increased education on fish, on how people use their fishing tackle. Don't leave leftover fishing lines in the bayou that still have hooks on them. Unfortunately, the turtles can ingest them, and that more than likely will result in the turtle dying. Continue this long-term research and education of the animal. Publish our findings so that agencies like Texas Parks and Wildlife can make informed conservation decisions on how to really help the species persist within Texas. Create a buzz about the species in Texas and Houston, especially. Take pride that this animal is here. It is an iconic species. I think it's fitting that this animal is here in Texas. It's in Houston. It's a resilient animal that's been around for millions of years, and it just seems to fit perfectly with the city. And we would love to see this species listed as the official reptile of Houston at some point. And with that, I would take any questions. Feel free to please log on to turtlesurvival.org to get more information on our work. The Turtle Survival Alliance is a global nonprofit group that has projects all over the world, in China, in the Philippines, in India, in South America, Madagascar, for highly endangered species of turtles that a lot of people don't know exist. Please feel free to log on and take a look. I really appreciate it. I'll take any questions.
That was awesome, Eric. These are magnificent animals. They are so cool. I had no idea they got so large and that they're right here in our urban environment.
Yeah, it came as a surprise to us as well. We've never expected to find them when we put traps in Buffalo Bayou, just to see the turtle species that were there. We expected soft shells and sliders and normal things of the area. We didn't expect to find these.
So one of the questions that came in was, does this raise any red flags about why we're finding them farther away from habitats that you're used to seeing them around the world? You know, finding them in Buffalo Bayou, is this something we should be worried about at all?
No, not at all. This is a fantastic thing. This species has always been in Buffalo Bayou. It's just that science has never observed it. As I mentioned, if you Google Buffalo Bayou and alligator snapping turtles, you'll find throughout the years that there are news articles about people finding large turtles in their pools after flood events. The turtle was known from Harris County. There are records in White Oak Bayou from the 60s. It was just never verified through science as being in Buffalo. There was an unverified record from the Brazos River, and there's a fossil record there, but currently there's no living animal that has been found within decades. We are currently studying the most western population of the species, southwestern population of the species known.
Interesting. Another question, wondering if, are you aware of the Restoring America's Wildlife Act that might bring funding to help protect the turtle's habitat here?
We are. The Turtle Survival Alliance goes through and tries to find funding for multiple species of concern, throughout its range, and that is one of the areas that we do target routinely for this species, for the bog turtle, for the wood turtle, diamondback terrapin.
Okay. More questions. People are interested on how you trap them. What does a turtle trap look like?
So it is a collapsible hoop net that has 6 hoops that are either made out of aluminum or fiberglass. It has mesh on it that is, the trap is typically about 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, and we bait it with fish.
Okay, all right, that makes sense. A question about, have you seen any impacts from the work on Buffalo Bayou, the bank repair that's going on? Does this at all interrupt any of their habitats?
There's potential of that. We have not seen any impacts yet. With particular work like that, we expect them to leave that area and go elsewhere. And then when that work is done, they'll come back. In other projects, that's what happens with turtles. They'll leave the area that's being directly impacted, especially through sound. If there's a lot of power driving going down and there's a lot of noise in the water, they're not going to want to stay in that area. So there could be some short-term effects of them leaving certain areas. We just haven't seen it yet. Our trapping is really highly dependent on water level, with Buffalo Bayou's ability to rise really high real quickly due to rain and runoff. We have to trap when Buffalo Bayou is low and median, because if we don't, we run the risk of drowning turtles. So we haven't been able to trap since early August due to conditions.
So is this a weekly trapping expedition, daily trapping? How often do y'all do it?
So we try for once a month, and it is Friday, Saturday, Sunday event where we set up 4 to 8 traps at site. On Friday, we check Saturday morning, Saturday afternoon, Sunday morning. And we try to at least do that once a month to hit the captures. It's just with the bayou, we really have to be cognizant of water level and dam release. Because if the water level is good, but the dams get released, then we're stuck in the same position where we can potentially drown turtles. So it's this trying to figure out the best time to trap. We're hoping after Hurricane Beta filled up the dams they've been releasing for the past week, we're hoping that the release stops pretty soon so we can actually get out and start trapping for October.
I think final question, you're being asked if someone sees one of these turtles, is there something they should do? Is there a report it somewhere? Do y'all need to know about it?
Yes, absolutely. Please feel free to report it to Texas Parks and Wildlife. The urban wildlife biologist Kelly Nord helps us out a lot with this work. He was one of the authors on the presentation. Also, contact the Turtle Survival Alliance. We're on all major social media, and I'd feel free to contact me on my email. It's emuncher@turtlesurvival.org. We would love to know if you're seeing across Houston. We know they're in other bayous. Right now our concentration is Buffalo, but we know that they're in Little Cypress, Spring Creek.
Wonderful. This is a great presentation, Eric. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. Really appreciate your comments and pictures of these incredible animals.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Take care, sir. We will move on. Our morning presenters are rolling right along, and I believe that next we are going to invite Jaime to get on the screen. And Jaime Gonzalez this morning is joining us from, he's the Houston Resilient Cities Director at the Nature Conservancy of Texas. You might have seen him recently on the news. He has been working on heat mapping in Houston, and known Jaime for quite a long time, fellow Houston Cougar. I think we're trying to get Jaime's connection back. So what I'm going to do is, while we're waiting, let's do another poll. So this year's presentation of the symposium, what would bring you to our, sorry, I'm getting the, there we go. What brought you to the symposium this year? Was it about the themes and speakers we're presenting? If you were in professional organizations that you can get CEUs? Is it networking? Oh, I wish I had that Treebeards lunch. That sounds really good, that red beans and rice. And we already know some of y'all, this is your first time, and we are very welcoming of you.
Hey, Chris, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay.
As soon as our responses are all collected, we can then actually see you.
Super, thank you so much.
So that looks pretty good on our response rate. We'll go ahead and close that and it will publish here in 1 second. So wonderful. It seems like people are responding to the theme. We always appreciate that. It takes the committee, like I said, we get started in January and February each year in thinking about this, and then we work all the way up until last night, right? Getting ready, and we'll take a few months off and start this all over again for the 21 version. But glad to have you all with us. And welcome. There's Jaime. We can see you now, and I think we're seeing your screen. Looks like you're about to start your presentation. I will also add that I have seen photographs, and because he's not shy about presenting them, of his wonderful native planting at his yard, at his home. But welcome, Jaime. Good to see you this morning. How you been?
I've been well. Thank you for having me. And you can see my presentation here?
Yes, indeed. You're ready to go.
Okay, awesome. All right, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I'm timing myself because I know you guys are on a great schedule today. Well, thank you for having me here with you all. I'm actually, this is a perfect COVID moment. I've been relegated to a side room. We have a kindergartner and a third grader learning in other rooms. So my usual office is taken this morning. So I'm glad to be with you nonetheless. I'm going to go ahead and start a conversation that will be continued by two of my colleagues, Katie Coyne and Carolyn White, about how we kind of look forward as we move into the next decade for really capturing what we need to capture and broadening the biodiversity and conservation field. As you know, we're at a real moment of inflection here in Houston. There's a lot of work happening around resilience. There's a lot of work happening around planning. And a lot of that work really is so essential to creating not just a city and a region that can handle more repetitive flooding, more urban heat, and all the other challenges of climate change. But also, in many ways, it's a way of creating a more nature-rich spot for all of us to enjoy. And as you know, there's lots of wonderful projects happening in Memorial Park, in Buffalo Bayou Park, along our bayous. You'll hear about all that stuff later. What I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to frame up some of the issues that we have around something called Conservation Moonshot 2030, which you will also hear from later on. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about some of the emerging trends that I think about as I do my work. So at the Nature Conservancy, we're really moving towards a couple of really big buckets of action. One is how do we better climate adapt areas and also attend to mitigation of carbon going to the atmosphere. The other thing is how do we ensure healthy lands, waters, and oceans? And so much of the work that could be better synchronized in the region could go to meeting both of those challenges simultaneously. So I'm just going to give you an idea of some of the things that I know are going on, some of the things that I'm going to suggest need to get bumped up a little bit, and we'll take it from there. So what is Conservation Moonshot 2030? And you'll, like I said, Katie and Carolyn do an excellent job of kind of expounding upon this idea. As we look at the conservation movement here in Greater Houston, Galveston, there are many good things that are happening. There's a process that Houston Galveston Area Council is leading right now, looking at how municipalities and governments can better coordinate with those of us who are looking to do conservation for any number of reasons. There's also the Houston Wilderness Process, the Gulf Houston Regional Conservation Plan. But as we look at these, we also always know that there are certain things that could use some more attention. And so one of the things that we'll talk a little bit about today are three spots where more attention, working with those groups and other groups, and a broader suite of folks in the region could really be helpful. So one of those areas is making sure to uplift underrepresented voices in conservation and resilience planning. One of the things that we have here in greater Houston is we have some truly amazing and innovative conservation directors. These conservation directors typically are at mid-level. They're the folks that are primarily responsible for ensuring the ecological health and value of preserves, both inside the city and outside the city. When we get into groups and discuss large regional targets for biodiversity conservation or for landscape conservation or resilience, oftentimes these folks are not brought along for enough of those conversations. And those folks are the folks who have the training, who have the kind of everyday experience with managing landscapes, who know the bottlenecks in terms of plant materials and resources and seed drills and other things that are needed to restore lands, but they also have the on the ground, knowledge about how to kind of hotspot properties that are worth conservation, evaluation, and protection. So we'd like to see more involvement with the conservation director level as we look at these regional conservation goals and objectives. Another region where we really think that we should see some more growth in getting more folks involved in the conversation centers on equity. And we really think that equity should be a centering lens for conservation and resilience work. And that just doesn't apply here in the middle of the city, where we should be attending to community needs by working to co-create solutions with communities. But rather it also applies to rural communities. There are quite a few rural communities that are underserved, have economic challenges, face undue burdens due to climate change risk as well. So it's really not an urban versus rural thing. We do find that there should be some more attention paid to that equity issue in terms of how we plan things. The second point is co-creation of language goals, objectives, and biodiversity targets through regional collaboration. So one of the great things that has emerged over the last few years is we now have, through Houston Wilderness and other folks, some targets for landscape level conservation. So we have percentages of land that we are on the same page about trying to save within a time frame, and the Houston Wilderness Project is 2040. But we do know that there are large land changes happening right now, and the population projections for the region, and we'll talk about that later, are really explosive. And one thing that we don't want to miss is that oftentimes there are issues that affect biodiversity that go beyond just whether or not that habitat and that landscape level conservation is happening. There are issues with buildings in cities. There are issues with cats outdoors. There are other issues with water pollution and other things that really limit biodiversity's ability to thrive, even if the actual physical habitats are there. So we also want to see a little bit more attention paid to what are the actual species that we're trying to conserve regionally, not just the landforms and the landscapes. And there's a number of ways to look at that. There are state resources that we can pull from. There are national resources that are international resources that are being developed. And lastly, and I think this may be amongst the most important, is there are many cities across the world where there is more of a combination of a vision around resilience, green infrastructure, biodiversity conservation for its own sake, and human health. And we think that Houston is a perfect framework for doing more of that, simply because if you look at the number of risks that we have in terms of climate, ongoing chronic issues with air and water quality, and other issues, that this is a great place to really innovate in that space of taking a more comprehensive lens in our work. And Katie Coyne's going to show you some really great visions for how that would work at the site level and at the neighborhood level. So I'm excited to see that. You know, one of the things that has become abundantly clear during this time of COVID is something that is an emerging field of study called One Health. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but basically, it's a fairly new recognition from a kind of a scientific inquiry standpoint, but it's a very old tradition, as old as the hills, in terms of recognizing that we live in a world where human, animal / biodiversity and environmental health are so intricately linked that really planning for one is not as optimal as looking for opportunities to influence all three simultaneously. And I think that so much of the work that's happening now, where we're doing community planning and green infrastructure, and the city of Houston with Kelly Andrasic and others are planting riparian forests, and the work that's happening in the Bayou Greenways is really kind of coming around to this notion of this combined health. And that if we have communities, even if the built environment is strong, if we don't have biodiverse, nature-rich spaces, that it has real impacts for physical and mental well-being. We also want to make sure, and you'll hear from Marissa Aho, I believe, tomorrow, who's our excellent Chief Resilience Officer, that everything is coordinated very well. So the last thing that we want to do is we don't want to get into a situation where we're working at odds, or we're not working in lockstep with our cities and our municipalities to meet their goals, and the ways in which green infrastructure and nature is really woven into these new and very helpful plans that were released last year. So I'm not going to belabor that point. It's just to say that the folks that were working on the Houston Climate Plan and Resilience Plan were really key on the co-benefits of nature and how it can make us both more resilient, it can reduce our carbon emissions, and it can also help to make our neighborhoods, particularly underserved neighborhoods, greener. So like I said, lots of international resources from folks like ICLEI, and this is kind of a recurring theme. As you look across the landscape around the world, there are many cities that have taken this challenge very seriously, two of which are Barcelona and Berlin. And I don't have time to get into that, but I would be happy to shoot you guys links where they are coming up with these combined plans that synchronize all of these various elements of human biodiversity and landscape health. And it's done in such a way that also tries to maximize economic benefit as well. So it's a trend that is definitely well entrenched in Europe, in some Asian cities, and it's something that we're increasingly seeing here in Houston. One thing that we hope to see with Conservation Moonshot is to really kind of bind those elements together a little bit more tangibly. And like I said, in the climate plan, there's lots of call outs for how nature-based solutions can reduce our emissions and increase our carbon holding capacity, how we can maintain carbon stocks that we already have in city parks and regionally in places like the Katy Prairie, the Columbia Bottomlands, places like that, and how we can reintegrate nature into our cities for its multiple benefits. So a couple of things real quick where we're going to have to innovate, and I mentioned this earlier. One of the things that we're going to have to do by 2030 is get a much better handle on how we include more people into the conversation. One thing that's occurring right now is a huge demographic shift. As you can see, the city's Hispanic population since 2000. And if you forecast out to 2030, so what we're going to see this huge boom in the Latino population. But this is a population that is not courted enough, although groups like SEER and other groups are doing a fantastic job of trying to make headway there. They're not courted enough. And so one of the kind of sustainability, durability issues for the conservation movement here is whether or not we can include more people of color and folks who have not been as involved in this discussion as possible. And that includes making sure that the environmental professionals in our area feel of color and who are underrepresented feel better supported. If you haven't visited the Green 2.0 initiative online, I highly encourage you to do so. It really chronicles how people of color coming into the movement are not always shepherded into leadership positions. They have kind of a mid-career swirl. And another aspect of it that I think that we could really use locally is if we're going to have a community that really embraces resilience and biodiversity and conservation, having a better support network for early career professionals, interns, and others who are people of color would be helpful in that. So to get to that target of building a better, more biodiverse region, we're going to have to make sure that the people that are going to be inhabiting this place in 2030 feel included in the co-creation. And that's not just from a kind of a community planning standpoint. It's also just there are many equity and justice issues that occur, and this is why we feel so certain that equity needs to be kind of embedded in the middle of this. We don't want it to be a tack on. We want it to speak directly to some of the inequities that have really been spotlighted by COVID in terms of who has access to nature versus who doesn't. Another thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to find better communicative ways of really instilling in the general population and with decision makers the real and present danger of climate change. So as you can see from this climate central graphic, our temperatures have gone way up since 1970. These are nighttime temperatures. And if you look at the city's recently released climate impact assessment, it paints a rather dire picture of where we're headed by mid-century in terms of temperatures. And one of the ways that I've heard someone speak about it is those temperature increases, if we do nothing, if we have a business as usual case, are the difference between a livable city and a non-livable city. And we're trying to get a better handle on this. A coalition of groups, including the City of Houston, HARC, Harris County Public Health, Nature Conservancy, and others, led the largest citizen science heat mapping project. And it was really with the goal of identifying all the hottest spots in the city and also in some of the surrounding county, with the goal of finding out where do we need to shoot to plant some of the 4.6 million trees that the city has set out as a goal for their plan. So we'll need some better science, as well as being able to convince people of the real dangers of heat. This is a picture I took during that heat mapping project in the medical center, and you can see the cooling value of this nature. I will say that the difference in temperature here was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit from the coolest to the hottest spot. So in an increasingly hot city, the wide-scale use of nature for resilience and heat reduction is going to be absolutely key. And one of the reasons we're going to have to do a better job is when the climate impact assessment was released, even though the city did a great job of getting it out there and releasing it, there was not very much of a reaction. Part of that is, and this comes from the Yale climate change communities, one thing that we're seeing across the board, this is for Harris County, these numbers, is that people don't believe that global warming is harming them particularly, even if they think it is a problem for plants and animals and for future generations. There is a disconnect. And that's kind of strange here in Houston, given the fact that there was just a reanalysis of Hurricane Harvey that upped the contribution that's attributable to climate change during Harvey to $67 billion. So we're also dealing with a situation, and I'm going a little bit quick, where Houston is no stranger to wildlife reductions. It really started back in the 1800s, but has rapidly increased. And a new report that was put out here recently looked at the world's wildlife and how in the last 46 years, we've lost 68%. So one of the things that we'd like to see with the Conservation Moonshot is how do we better align kind of international goals for wildlife and biodiversity protection with regional goals, because we are really an exceptional area. One thing that that we saw earlier this year with the City Nature Challenge is we competed against over 200 cities to catalog biodiversity. And although it wasn't a competition this year because of COVID, if it were a competition, we would have come in first place with over 200 global cities. So we have an exceptional biodiversity base here, but it's not well known. And it is under a great threat because the population is set by 2030 to jump from about 6.7 million in our region to about 8.8. So where are we going to fit all these folks? What are the landscapes that are going to replace some of our wild lands right now? Can we make those better functioning instead of building what we typically build? And how can we better get a handle on the intersection between wild areas in the region and the city? This is a bird forecast for today, which means that birds are passing through our area in very high numbers. And so folks like Audubon and other folks that are concerned with bird conservation are working to get the word out to turn the lights out so that they have an easier time transiting through. I'm just going to kind of skip ahead real quickly because I'm 20 minutes in. I will just end this by saying the last thing we'll need to do is we'll need to find ways of tapping into new markets and new financing to get all this work done because it's going to be very expensive. One of the things that the Pathways model showed in the Houston Climate Action Plan is to get to a net zero for carbon, the number of carbon offsets, and we really were work to try to get a regional focus on buying offsets from regional markets is going to increase rather rapidly as we get towards that 2050. So that might provide some more money. But one other thing that we're going to have to do, and I'll probably end it here so we can start, is we're going to have to rejigger in the minds of the general public what it means to conserve animals and the environment. And that's part of the reason why combining it with resilience, with human health, with other things that are more top of mind with folks is going to be so very important. As you take a look here in this latest Giving USA, categories to the environment and animals are 3% of donations philanthropically. If you look at things like human services and health and other things that are combined with what could be a collective effort to design a more green, more resilient region, they rank much higher. And it's because there is this cognitive disconnect sometimes between people in terms of what animals in the environment mean and what these human services mean. And so making a closer cognitive connection between our resilience challenges, our green infrastructure, human health, and biodiversity is really essential to finding better avenues towards getting more money to help support all this work. All right, I'm going to exit. And I will come back. I think I have 3 minutes.
Great, Jaime. You're doing fine on time. Thank you very much. Your efforts, I mean, this has been something that you have dedicated your career to in multiple ways. Talk a little bit about the changes that you've seen in your time in advising people of the importance of these environmental factors within an urban environment. What kind of changes have you seen? How much more responsiveness have you seen from the general public about these issues in your time?
Well, I think that it's, yeah, so I started my career at the Houston Arboretum back in 1998. I'll speak up two different aspects of it. One is I think that there's been a lot more focus on nature equity. So what sorts of nature and how accessible is it to communities that might have different resources? So I think the Trust for Public Lands park scores really help to kind of create a scorecard that allows people to see that some communities are not only they have less abundant nature, but what that does, it really translates into health outcomes. So some of these neighborhoods, the tree canopy isn't as good. And if you don't have good tree canopy, not only is it a heat issue, it exacerbates air quality issues. Air quality issues exacerbate everything from cardiovascular disease to now diabetes and lung function and all those things. So I think one of the big things that can happen with things like heat mapping, targeted tree planting and things like that is we can really target human health interventions. And we can do it in a way, I believe, that if chosen carefully, the plant palettes that we choose instead of just planting single species monocultures, if we can do things like planting a selected suite of plants that we can combine for maximum wildlife value, you not only get the aesthetic appeal, but you also have an uplift for biodiversity as well. And you give kids in some of these neighborhoods who might not have a chance to go to state parks or national parks a chance at seeing wildness. So that's one aspect. I think that, obviously Hurricane Harvey really changed the game in terms of discussing the need to develop a more robust culture around green infrastructure, especially green stormwater infrastructure, and the need to really work in a combinational fashion between organizations and public-private partnerships to create models for what green infrastructure look like. And the last thing is just connectivity. And we'll hear about connectivity from Carolyn White. I think it's a massive, as you know, it's a massive topic for our area. I think that groups like Katy Prairie Conservancy, Bayou Lane Conservancy, folks who are working on a headwaters to baywaters concept for this very large, mostly rural trail system and land protection idea, and combining it with things like Beyond the Bayous and the Bayou Greenway is 2020 has the opportunity to really open up an entirely new palette, which will serve both wildlife and people well. So I think that those are three trends that I've seen, and then just in an international sense, just this notion that biodiversity itself is a more quantifiable value for cities in a much different way than we've looked at it before, and making it a priority in cities. So those are kind of four things that I've been seeing.
I would agree. And when something you mentioned about the monoculture is on a question from an attendee, and I'm just going to read part of it because it's well put. This person is observing what's going on White Oak Bayou, that it's being treated basically as a manicured lawn, perhaps because of the misguided belief that this has a significant impact on water flow velocity during flood stages, and that they have seen mowers cut blooming meadows that are actively being exploited by the pollinators, right? And that monoculture of grass has not only degraded the biodiversity, but it's also compacted the soils, which contributes to the water absorbency of them, reflective heat, all that kind of stuff. Really, rather than a question, it was looking for your thoughts, and I think you kind of put it exactly that way. The monoculture is not the right thing to do, and so maybe the question is, how can we work better with Harris County Flood Control to treat the bayous in a more, less like ditches? It's what I've been saying all along is bayous are not ditches. These are living facilities that need to be treated differently. What can we do to encourage some difference in the way that flood control looks at these? Because they're managing a huge system with a very diverse system. Our bayous are all different. Every one of them has a different look and feel. But talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, so I mean, to be fair, I think that flood control has made a lot of moves to reduce mowing cycles in some cases, and actually, to revegetate. I think that it's a really great question to which I don't have a super great answer. I will say that grassland management writ large, and I'm talking about power lines, bayous, lawns, all those things, should be really something that we're researching. We think it's, I don't think, I've been looking for it. I've talked to a lot of people. I don't think anybody's kind of quantified the different grassland types throughout Harris County. But if we can think about differential grassland management and all the co-benefits that come with that, one of the things about a grass mower is that if you run a mower for 1 hour, it's the equivalent of driving a car for 5,000 miles. They are extraordinarily dirty. And so not only are we impacting the biodiversity and the grass's abilities through evaporative cooling to cool the city, we're also throwing a lot of carbon emissions and a lot of dirty air into. And so if Harris County is indicative of some other kind of similar cities, it could be 30% of the land cover. And most of these places, not along the bayous for sure, but lawns, for instance, sometimes get mowed 42 times a year. So any time where we can take mowing and reduce those cycles, we're going to be doing better for the wildlife. We're going to be doing better for the air quality and the people.
That's a great point, Jaime, and I think it's illustrated perfectly by the reduction in pollution that we've seen around the world during COVID, when people stopped using those two-stroke engines to get around some of the European cities and such, and dramatic increases in sight distance. You can see that change in these other cities, and so that's something we don't talk a lot about here, because we do have a really mowing culture, right?
We do. I think part of it is just getting away from this. You know, it's funny because I think that we adopted the English aesthetic for lawns, but we didn't adopt the English aesthetic for kind of meadows next to lawns. And so if we can get some of those meadows, the rough with the smooth, it's great aesthetic, but it also has so much more ecosystem function.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and excellent. So I think with that, I don't have any more. Oh, I do have one more question. Looks like
Okay.
I think this is in reference to one of your slides there. What was included in the public good category? I think that references the monies donated.
The Giving USA? That's a
Yeah.
great question. I don't know the answer to that public good. I mean, that could be sliced in any sort of way. So I don't know the answer to that. But if you go to Giving USA, you can download this whole report. It's very instructive. One of the things that there is a nascent opportunity to do here. It's being run through something called the Interfaith Network, Interfaith Environmental Network of Houston. Is there could be a much better synchrony between the faith community of interfaith values that are doing environmental work. There's an incredibly rich interfaith community doing environmental work with the NGOs, the state and federal governments who do not take a faith value in that way. They're more science-based. That's one place where we can close the gap in terms of equity, like who's involved in these conversations and who's involved in the work, just so that we build a broader coalition to get all these things done. So I don't know what the public goods is, but I'm hoping that some of those groups that are working independent of many of us will start to work in better synchrony.
Well, Jaime, thank you very much. This was a wonderful end to our morning presentations, our first group of presentations. Really thank you for being here, and continued good luck on your heat island and heat effect work. It is so dramatic, those images that you have shown and that I've seen. It's great exposure for your work that hopefully will show us how we can better manage the bridge between our built environment and our natural environment. So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, everyone, and have a great day.
So we are at the point of our morning where we're going to take a short break. Before we do, I want to show our appreciation for the continued support of all of our sponsors, frankly. So real quickly, I just want to acknowledge, I think I'm going to acknowledge everybody. Our platinum sponsors, AECOM, EHRA Engineering, Port Houston, SWCA Environmental Consultants, Resource Environmental Solutions, RES. We have our gold sponsor, Houston Galveston Area Council, and they've been running all of our technology platform today, so thank you very much to them. Our silver sponsor, Tally Landscape Architects. Our panel sponsors, Hawes Hill and Associates and Harris County Flood Control District. We have our Bayou Break sponsors, Civil Tech Engineering, Allen Boone Humphreys Robinson, Bayou Midstream, BGE Engineers, and Cobb Fenley. And then our virtual swag bag sponsors, which you can download, Alan Bernstein, Issachar Robinson, Friends of Woodlands Park, and Sheed Conservation Solutions. Thank you very much to all of our sponsors today and tomorrow. We're now going to have our first bio break, our BIO break. Feel free to get up, stretch, step away from the screen for a few minutes. We're going to show some videos from some of our sponsors during this break, but this is a 5-minute break, and we will be right back with you for the next presentation at 10 o'clock.
EHRA Engineering prides itself on a long-standing history of delivering exceptional solutions. Founded in 1936, what began as serving land developers with paving, drainage, and utility design has since expanded to adapt to the ever-changing needs of the communities we serve. As a multidisciplinary civil engineering firm, we provide a comprehensive approach to meet the demands of our growing region as we maintain our mission of engineering the future. EHRA is proud to support the Bayou Preservation Association's 17th Annual Symposium.
We are the scientists, the planners, the technical specialists, and the creative thinkers.
Our 100% employee-owned firm offers a range of environmental compliance services combined with local knowledge, regulatory expertise, and high-quality service.
We are committed to preserving our natural and cultural resources, giving back to our communities, and prioritizing safety both in the field and the office.
With a nationwide presence that has been growing since 1981, we remain one.
We are SWCA.
We are SWCA.
We would like
like to thank the first responders for being on the front lines on the fight against coronavirus.
Thank you.
Thank you for all you do to keep us safe.
Thank you so much for all the hard work you've been doing to keep us all healthy.
Thank you for all you do in keeping us safe and sound.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for all your work. You're awesome.
For all you do in every way. Thank you.
On behalf of my exceptional business partners and incredible colleagues here at EHRA Engineering, we would like to extend a hearty and heartfelt thank you to all of our veterans, first responders, medical professionals, and elected officials. Y'all, please stay safe, keep your health, and always remain positive. We will get through this together. See y'all soon.
So welcome back, everybody. Our next speaker is Carolyn White. She's the Conservation Director at the Memorial Park Conservancy. You may have seen some of the incredible modifications being done at the park's entry here in the last year, and there's some new transportation improvements, huge transportation improvements on the horizon, which I'd encourage you to go check out on their website. You can see what they're planning, but she is here with us today to elaborate on a network of biodiversity in our city. So Carolyn, welcome very much. Thank you for being here. We see your slide.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you. Hi, Carolyn.
Hey, how are you?
Great. Thanks so much for being here. Off you go.
All right, sounds good. Let's see. Does that work? Trying to minimize these so I can see the screen. Okay, yes, today I wanted to thank you all for inviting me to speak here. I wanted to today walk through some landscape ecology concepts, figure out, and talk about Houston's legacy as it relates to landscape planning. I'll step through a geographic perspective and dive into some planning efforts as it relates to corridors and refuges, especially in this Houston area. And then I'll end up with a demonstration of sort of a music scale ecosystem planning that we're doing at Memorial Park. And give some time at the end to talk a bit about the Conservation Moonshot 2030 plan that Jaime had talked about earlier. And I know Katie Coyne will talk a little bit more about that, and then Marissa Yosa tomorrow with the Houston Parks Board will also be following up with some of those concepts. But what I wanted to do is really step back in time and look at the history of landscape ecology and conservation. It's really rooted in wilderness studies and the enactment of legislation to preserve and fund the acquisition of public lands. Just as Rodney has spoken about this morning, it's an important effort for a unified sort of collective funding and preserving of that common land. And that concept, comes from a long ways away and has kind of gotten into the U.S., but is really up to individuals and some key people to really pull it all together. So thinking about Aldo Leopold, Olaus Murie, and David Brower as they crafted the Wilderness Act that was passed in the mid-1960s. Then we have municipal, regional, and state and federal planning strategies that have emerged focusing on resource management, such as Luna Leopold, Aldo Leopold's son, who was a pioneer in the field of water resource planning and environmental planning that focused on stream restoration. And then as development and pressures required increasing urban suburban edge planning, and design, it's led us into those engineered solutions. And just as that question that Jaime was posed earlier, how are we able to sort of break away from those engineered solutions, which we have, demonstrated locally to not be as effective as planned. So we're now at a point where we can look back and tie some of these perspectives together into a landscape biodiversity and a conservation framework. What I like to think of is it's a storytelling. And the storytelling is a string of pearls of holistic thinkers, Aldo Leopold going to Luna Leopold, to David Roskin, to Terry Hershey, a huge legacy of a string of pearls of stories there. And then, of course, Olmsted to Comey to Kevin Shanley locally, looking at a geographic landscape too, we can also see that this emerald necklace can also be telling that story geographically and in our landscape. So speaking of emerald necklaces, we look at Boston, the park planning that was built in the 1870s. It was an early Olmsted design focusing on parkways and greenways that offered relief and refreshment from pressures and tensions of everyday life. Similarly, those plans were designed, and here's an overlay on the current aerial photo showing that emerald necklace that really does emanate right from central Boston out into sort of that urban edge. Similarly, we see other cities that adopted an emerald necklace concept in Cleveland. In Minneapolis, we have the Grand Round that was designed by Horace Cleveland. And these concepts have also been adopted in many other cities, including Los Angeles. And they're not only for human use and respite, but for a way for wildlife to then be able to have corridors and patches within the urban landscape and suburban landscape to find their way, especially the edges of these structures. The edges of the corridors, the edges of those patches are where the most robust urban wildlife would be found. So in Houston, the planning legacy that we have is quite diverse. What we have, when I looked into the Houston planning's legacy, I found about 175 different separate plans for this portion of the region or the region. It's in a queryable database, so I could note that about 8 of those plans applied to parks, 3 or so applied to conservation, and a dozen or so or more were for watershed and stormwater planning. And the latest overarching frameworks that we have are the Climate Action Plan and the Resilience Plan, which I know Katie will talk about a bit more, and Jaime definitely talked about those too. And those 2 plans are, quite groundbreaking for the Houston area and quite interesting. So in the Resilience Plan, we see at least 3 major points to connect these ecological patches and create corridors. As Jaime had mentioned, the Regional Conservation Plan also noted the other sort of corridor initiatives that are on their way. So starting with when we step back in time to Houston and we string together those pearls and we can conjure up our own emerald necklace, we can start with, of course, Comey, a student of Olmsted's, who traveled from Boston to create a plan for Houston in 1912, which at the time centered around downtown Houston and its surroundings. And while it was most largely incomplete and unrealized. But we jump forward now in time to 2012 when the Houston citizens passed a bond referendum for the funding of the Bayou Greenways Initiative, a park plan that had been conceived through public-private partnerships and was fully underway at that point. And coming to 2020 and sort of the full realization of many of these trail systems, it's really a remarkable perspective on corridor and patch planning. So these corridors that link patches of biodiversity within are of course within a largely developed matrix. Drawing from the ecoregion mosaic, the mosaic of the Houston area is largely an urban one, mostly developed and paved over, and then we can devise over a fairly short time distance a rich biodiverse conservation plan. So we're looking at the ecoregions as a sort of a framework to bring some of these disparate habitats back into the city and connect them from the urban core back out into the edges of the urban environment. So we can devise over a fairly short distance a rich biodiverse and conservation plan. And in horizontal transect perspective, it's quite rich, everything from deep wooded riparian habitats. Oops. Yes, these photos have to pop up one at a time. Oops. And then, you know, from the deep, rich riparian habitats all the way to coastal prairie and then upland forest as well. So we have this vast richness in a fairly short horizontal transect, but we also have a vast richness in this vertical structuring of these habitats for sustainable biodiversity that further enriches the entire ecological landscape of Houston. So what is the base pattern that we have to work with? When you look at it from the night's view, you can see these natural corridors, you can see the freeway corridors. And so the question is, where can we find our natural system to connect into a landscape model? So using the land cover base of 2011 NOAA data, I'm going to go through sort of steps to overlay different linear features over this landscape. So of course we start with our waterways, the major waterways, and then this incredibly rich network of minor waterways that were mostly linear and constructed to drain development, and over top the freeway system, which kind of divides the entire city into a fairly a robust grid. You can see the rich potential in the green space potential between the 610 loop and Beltway 8. And just as Jaime had mentioned, in Berlin, they've been studying the biodiversity of their urban center for a long time. And they found that in the urban setting, the greatest variety of land use patterns and the highest number of species per square kilometer can be found in the transition between the city center and the outskirts, where urban structures are closely associated with open spaces like parks, urban forest, and larger wastelands. And so I think the study, like Jaime said, of looking at grass diversity, looking at mapping out of all of our sort of potential opportunities for patches and then these connective corridors is quite something that we can definitely pursue in the Houston area to really provide a very robust biodiverse plan. So working with nature and the challenges that flooding has occurred in the area, you can see that the broader and deeper floodplains are backed up behind freeways. How do we use that? So those wider floodplains to create those refuges along those corridors. When we drop in the parks and flood control properties, that was just a closer perspective. You drop on the parks and then flood control properties, which are largely detention basins, mostly now moving towards wet bottom detention basins with really rich wildlife potential. You can see that there's a large capacity for open space and patches throughout the Houston area. One thing we wanted to really note was that we do have the rich, amazing corridors offered by transmission lines. And this is a particularly interest to us in Memorial Park because one of those transmission lines runs right through the park. And you can see how these transmission lines can connect through and across the bayou and the bayou greenways. So zooming in on Houston, you can see Memorial Park is a kind of a shining little gem right in the middle of this city. And I like to see it as sort of a microcosm, like I said, of urban planning. We had a lot of issues, of course, with the plan for the park being kind of what we call a pop and drop kind of planning. We had a park divided, separated and degraded landscapes. And by connecting the dots and working towards a more connected ecosystem model rooted in the study of the soils, the drainage, the topography, and over a long period of time, the master plan was developed that had a basis in ecological restoration. So adopted in 2015 by the City Council, we are embarking on that healing of those ecosystems, bringing back the ecosystem services, and really making quite a mosaic of native habitats for Houstonians. So this is our management unit mapping. We have everything from a riparian to upland forest, savanna, and native grassland or coastal prairie. It's going to be a long time realizing all of this, but we have a good start on it. Eastern Glades just opened, and we're now working towards the remaining portions of our 10-year build-out. So wanted to focus a bit on this central connector project, which we're calling the Land Bridge and Prairie Project. But also included in this plan is the connectivity of Memorial Park through this utility corridor, and then some east-west connectivity as well. Looking at the Land Bridge and Prairie Project, it's a wet prairie complex with a streamway that's running underneath Memorial Drive, draining much of this wet prairie complex down into the natural bayou to the south that reaches Buffalo Bayou. In this aerial photo, you can see that streamway that will be created. It will be most likely much more forested on this north side than shown on this illustrative, but it does provide this wildlife corridor through the entire system and down into the Buffalo Bayou and the Bayou Wilds to the south. The connection for humans and other wildlife over Memorial Drive will be on these two mounded features. And when we looked at that wet prairie complex and tried to determine, how to create that mosaic, we looked at reference sites. Sheldon Lake was a very good state park model of a wet prairie complex that we could model through the topography as well as the plant palette. Again, this connectivity in a graphical sense shows for all users, pedestrians to animals and aquatic wildlife to be able to go through the system and across Memorial Drive in this location. And here's just a kind of sense of what the scale of this project is will be, and it's under construction right now. So the Coastal Prairie Trail, we mentioned that north-south trail that's going to be created, and it's in design now, that will run from basically Memorial Drive to the north down to San Felipe. it will be, sort of running through what we have in Memorial Park as the best remnant coastal prairie portions in the heart of the city. These images from our easement, the Centerpoint easement, where the coastal prairie trail will be running, can also be found in some of the remnants to the south. South of Bray's Bayou, we have amazing prairie remnants along this same corridor. And again, this segment from Memorial Drive to San Felipe is under design right now. So images of that coastal prairie trail and the kind of experience that people will have as they go from north to south, connecting to Bray's Bayou, connecting Buffalo Bayou to White Oak Bayou, and creating a very robust wildlife corridor for the Houston area. So wanted to just follow up with the conversation that Jaime had started, and we'll continue. Again, the conservation moonshot concept is one where these underrepresented voices, the sort of boots on the ground conservationists, are working towards this sort of regional conservation resilience planning and looking towards real targets, real thresholds, and advancing some of our understanding of the landscape, and even just the grassland mapping, that kind of efforts that will really sort of start developing and synchronizing a resilient plan for this area. And of course, looking at the One Health model and other cities and other locations that have done some excellent work in conservation planning. So that's sort of the end of my presentation. I'm open for questions. And I guess I'll escape from.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to add some more questions, those you can get to that in actually that question flyout in your control panel. But Carolyn, thank you so much. There's been a lot of activity in the park in your tenure. You were at flood control for quite some time, so you've got a real knowledge of our region's flooding issues. The park itself, I guess, doesn't experience that much flooding from Buffalo Bayou. Is that really just based on the topography next to that bayou?
Yes, it's definitely sort of a higher regime than most of the bayou wilds that we have. Sort of 600 acres to the south does get quite a lot of inundation, a lot of backwater coming up into Memorial Park, and those tributaries, those fingers of riparian corridors that are in the southern part of the park. But the bulk of the park up on the north side and the public use areas are much higher in topography.
And is that kind of contribute to some of that tree die-off that we saw several years back during the the scorching long months that we had back? What was that, about 4 or 5 years ago, 6 years ago?
Yeah. So the park itself, the story of the trees, it became sort of an opportunistic forest after the park was developed. It had been ranch land, mostly grasslands. Camp Logan was there, but it was a much more coastal prairie, potentially savanna in some locations type of habitat, a very grassland-based system, except for, of course, the riparian edge along Buffalo Bayou, which is about 4 miles, and those tributaries. The opportunistic forest that came as pressures from fire or grazing or any haying was released, the forest came in with a dense thicket, and really a lot of non-native species came in along with nursery trade, and so the forest was not very resilient and wasn't able to weather the Hurricane Ike or the drought very well. And we saw the major die-off in those drier upper regions of the park, where the riparian edges in the south were more spared.
Mm-hmm. And so the master plan really seeks to kind of solve a lot of those issues by putting species in the right places within the overall park setting, right?
Correct.
Yeah. How is the so you've got to deal with a golf tournament now for the first time in quite some time. There was the Houston Open was in the park many decades ago, and then was up in the woodlands and most recently up by the airport. But now it's coming back into the inner city here. What are you having to do to kind of protect your grasslands from being trampled by spectators? You know, because this is the park is such a unique setting in that it's so to outsiders so natural in such a dense urban environment. You know, even has this major thoroughfare going through the middle of it. It's used in so many different ways. Are you going to have to do anything to kind of protect, or is this an opportunity to show off what the park is to all these visitors?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that potential for show off. We're hoping that all of the satellite parking and the shuttling of people and the crowd management really sticks to the footprint of the golf course. They are sort of popping through some public access points that will get you to the West Memorial Loop and to the north side near the tennis center. But we've been working a lot with the city and the Astros Foundation to make sure that crowd control really does not impact the park natural areas.
It's good to hear. It's going to be exciting though, having the kind of all eyes on it. And your new projects is the look on those, and particularly in your slides showing the new land bridges are man, that's going to be just a wonderful addition. Is there been my lights just went off? The energy code. I need to get up and move, I guess. Carolyn, the overall look and feel of the park has changed, over the decades. Is what is coming with this master plan? Is that kind of the, if you will, the final vision, or is this park going to continue to evolve over the decades?
Well, I mean, basically any plan, landscape plan and master plan for sure, sort of sets the stage for an establishment of a good, robust habitat, the biodiversity and the sort of connection between the edges of those habitats and ecotones that will kind of blur and change and start becoming more robust themselves. But really, a lot of any planning effort really comes down to the operations and maintenance and the management. So all of our projects in the 10-year plan have built-in funding for O&M that really is hoping to kind of keep those habitats in check and not allow that opportunistic forest, for example, to just come back, which in this landscape will happen. We've seen many remnant prairies just overtaken by forests that had just not been managed.
Let's see. Well, Carolyn, thank you very much for letting everyone see what your plans are in the park, and it is such a wonderful place and a real jewel to the overall Houston park system. So thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Chris.
And so I think what I'm going to do here, we have another poll question that I'm going to launch. So I'd like to know now, what do you think is the most important value of our bayous? What means the most to you? Is it about recreation? Do you see the value in the flood protection that they provide? We've seen wildlife, particularly today. We highlighted the snapping turtles. We do have some people that maybe not transportation, but they definitely get in there and recreate on the bayous. Please don't answer that they're just ditches. And keep this in mind, and you heard it earlier, anything that touches a city street in our area, there's no filter for the trash that goes down the openings into our storm sewers, and those storm sewers go directly into our bayous at all. So we really have to stay away from the idea that these bayous are just ditches. A few more responses coming in. About 70% of you have voted. Clicking up higher. So we use these questions as a way to kind of check ourselves in Bayou Preservation Association, make sure that we're continuing to talk about the things that are most important to everyone, and provide content and programs that match with your responses. So I'll go ahead and close this one and it'll tally the results. And so flood protection and wildlife habitat. Well, shining a light on the wildlife habitat is certainly a way that we want to continue to illustrate the value of these bayous, because the diversity of the species that we find here is rather unique. This is such an urban environment, and seeing a wildlife habitat along these bayous is just a wonderful thing. There's not another real example that I can think of that has this level of permeation through the city. The bayous just go through every part of the city, and very, very unique. So I appreciate your results there. And now we are going to invite our next speaker to join us. Let's get Katie Coyne in. There's Katie. Katie is from Massaquoi Robinson, where she leads the Urban Ecology Studio. And as a land planner myself, I'm really encouraged to see the integration of design principles such as resiliency, which she's added to her toolkit. It's really a different way to think about how we plan cities, and it makes her a perfect guest today to talk about what we've learned about our biodiversity. So welcome to the symposium, Katie. It's all yours.
Thanks, Chris. I'm just trying to get my screen share going. I think it's still thinking.
There we go.
Can you see this?
Yes, we can. You're off and running.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. All right, so my name is Katie Coyne. I'm going to talk about bayou diversity for and by whom. And so Carolyn and Jaime have both talked a lot about the moonshot, and I'm really going to talk about lessons from practice that I've learned. I'm going to touch on 7 lessons that I think are going to allow us to do our work differently, to fundamentally change the way we do conservation work. And I think that's a big part of what the moonshot is really about. So I come from Massaquoi Robinson. I'm a principal there. We're a planning, urban design, and landscape architecture firm founded in Houston with offices in Austin, New Orleans, and Minneapolis now. And I lead our urban ecology studio. This is an internal practice that works across scales, everything from site scale design to regional planning, and really aims to integrate more science and data into our equity-driven work. I always like to give a little bit more of a background than what you can get from the bio that was sent out before I dive in, because I hope anyway that this is a way for y'all to understand a little bit more about how my experiences have driven the values I have in the work I do. So my first job was with the Girl Scouts, and so this really taught me the importance of service, how much strong women and girls can accomplish when working together, and a really deep appreciation of nature. My undergraduate education was always focused on ecological science, but I was always trying to figure out how I can tie in social science and economics into the way I think about ecology. But that wasn't really something that the academic system was set up for, and I'll talk about that in a minute. I did some work around outdoor education for a little while. I did research as a coastal fisheries researcher. Also thought for a little while I found a little bit of a niche, really tying together women's rights and reproductive rights with health science. So I worked for Planned Parenthood for a little bit, and then went into Peace Corps. So I served in Fiji, which I know if I were in person, I would get a lot of like, oh, that must have been tough. And it was beautiful, but it was a really interesting experience to really understand intimately the connections between environmental degradation and socioeconomic systems. So I was doing advocacy work in rural villages to try to restore coastal ecosystems, ensure folks had clean drinking water, and also did some work with Fiji women's rights movement, and really actually taught some classes on the connection between women's rights and environmentalism. I put bartending on here, not because it's something I put on my normal professional resume, but my tips depended on my ability to communicate. And so more than a lot of things I've done in the past, that really taught me how to communicate with just about anyone. I was at the same time teaching high school science. I taught AP environmental science for a little while, and really decided that I wanted to find a space where I could really think about all the different systems I love to think about in a way that's going to result in better, more resilient, more equitable outcomes for our cities. So I went to grad school. It's what brought me to Texas. I say hook 'em horns in lockstep with Go Gators. But I went to school for community and regional planning and sustainable design at UT. And then, that brought me to my work at Asa Kerr Robinson, leading the urban ecology studio. And some of the other things I'm involved with that, keep me a little further away from my wife than I'd like sometimes because I'm a little too busy, are some of these service positions that I take on, including with the City of Austin, the Trail Foundation, and Equality Texas, which is the largest LGBTQ advocacy and lobbying organization in the state. So that's a little bit of background about me. So this is a question I ask a lot. I'm talking to landscape architects a lot. I'm talking to naturalists. I'm talking to people who think about parks and public spaces. I'm talking to planners and designers. What can thoughtfully designed landscapes do? So this is a key question for our work. And one of the frameworks we use to really evaluate the work that we do is ecosystem services. So this is a graphic that we created to look at how a specific version of a plan for a new development that we were looking at might promote different ecosystem service values, relatively speaking. And so we constantly reference back to this framework to really understand how we're maximizing the value that our landscapes are providing from a functional perspective for people in our cities. And I think we do a lot of work on parks and a lot of work on public spaces that are really urban, and especially in places like Houston, especially with the recent climate impact assessment that came out by Atmos Research, we know now more than ever it's really important that our landscapes do more, and we can do that with good design and planning. But then really what I'm focusing on today is who has benefited from our green work in the past. And so the way we have done this work, where we have focused geographically on this work of ecosystem services, on conservation, has not benefited everyone equally. And this is not going to be a masterclass in here's all the ways that we've done that not great in the past and that hasn't benefited everyone equally. This is going to be much more focused on how do we fix that now? How do we think differently about process? So I am just going to offer a couple of quotes about that. So this one's about our history. This is from an article called The Soul of the Environmental Movement. If the environmental movement is ever going to revive, it must first confront the many ways in which the United States has reserved open space for the exclusive use of whites. And so if you Google environmentalism, conservation, racism, racial justice, environmental justice, there are likely thousands of both popular and peer-reviewed articles about this topic. And it's important that as we're fundamentally changing the way we do this work to be more inclusive, to think about a different way of framing that provides more equitable ecosystem service benefits, that we understand that history so that we don't repeat ourselves. And then this really speaks to what Jaime was talking about earlier about, not just how do you get new voices to the table, but what do you do when they get there? So this quote, the mainstream environmental movement has been unable to racially integrate its senior staff, not because of overt discrimination, but because of differences in vision. Many environmentalists of color admire the mainstream movement's goals, but they also know firsthand that social justice is routinely ignored in the mainstream movement's decision-making. So I'm going to loop back around to this at the very end of my presentation about how we frame equity as a core part of green infrastructure, resilience, environmental conservation work, but this is something I really want us to think about, and this first point I'm going to make is also a part of this. So I'm going to, like I said, make 7 points about key themes from my practice that I think are going to help us fundamentally change the way we do this work. So this first one is ditching the silos, and I mean this in 2 different ways. Silos, like the academic silos that kept me from really studying about social systems and social justice at the same time as ecological systems. So the academic systems are set up in silos, also practice silos. So when I'm doing my work on a parks plan, there's a lot of planners in the room. We might have some environmentalists, but there are other disciplines that really bring so much value to the way we do that work, and I'll talk more about that. But then I also mean lived experiences. And so how we silo different communities and lived experiences in projects is also problematic. And the reason I put an asterisk on this and say with empathy is because this isn't just about come to the table and learn how we do our science and then help us in the way we think we should be helped. This is with empathy means that you're open-hearted, you're vulnerable to changing fundamentally the way we do things. And that's difficult. I recognize that that is something that's really difficult to do. And so with empathy means that we're going to be open to hearing what a different lived experience, a different discipline might say about the way we could do work differently with different outcomes, recognizing that the outcomes in the past have not been equitable. So in terms of how we do this work, so we've done a lot of parks planning recently. These are some graphics from ParksMart Precinct 1. We just wrapped up the Pasadena Healthy Parks Plan, and it's going to council this month. We actually just got announced today that we got a Texas APA Gold Award for the Travis, Bastrop, and Caldwell County Healthy Parks Plan. And so this is really where we're fundamentally, I'm going to stop saying fundamentally so much, but we are really trying to make sure that the folks both advising on a task force or an advisory committee for these plans and our internal team bring different expertise so that when we design a park, we're thinking about all the different ecosystem service benefits, and we have the experts who understand how placemaking and community building is just as important as green infrastructure, urban habitat, or active living. Another example is also how we're evolving to take on different kinds of clients, different kinds of audiences for our planning and design work. So this is some work that we did for Episcopal Health Foundation called the Healthy Places Toolkit. And we were brought in by Episcopal Health. They have a group of community clinics that they partner with every couple of years. They have a different cohort, and they're trying to provide resources to those clinics for those clinics to be more active in outcomes of the built environment. And so this entire toolkit is set up across, you can kind of see the table of contents in the background. This entire toolkit is set up across different aspects of the built environment and what clinics and healthcare workers could do to work upstream of health outcomes and improve the built environment in their communities where they're providing health services. And then how does this translate to site scale? So this is a photo actually from Jaime Gonzalez of the MD Anderson Prairie that we helped to design. And this is a great example of the intersection of how we can think about health benefits and how we can think about ecological benefits in a really urban place. And this has resulted in some fantastic research that's happened to really look at the impacts here. We just also finished a green roof for another hospital in Houston that some of the folks at the hospital are actually studying the health impacts of having that green roof accessible to patients. All right, second core practice, systems thinking across scales. So what is systems thinking? This is a transect that we use to really understand different systems and how they interact with each other. So this is, again, getting at that idea that we can't just look at ecological systems in a bubble. We need to think about urban heat. We can look at economic systems like tourism. We can look at social systems and environmental injustices. And when we layer all these together in a graphic like this, it allows us to have more productive conversations about how these systems might be interacting. So that's just one example of how we use systems thinking in our work. And then also across scales. So Resilient Houston, I am so excited. Marissa Aho is one of the speakers for this symposium. Resilient Houston's a great example of how the entire framework of a plan is set up across scales. So the first chapter is really looking at individual and family scale, all the way up to regional scale with bayous in the center as that connective tissue. And so really great example of how we're thinking across scales and that we're not going to have blind spots about missed opportunities or even negative externalities of our work because we weren't thinking across scales or across different systems. Third, a balance of community voice and scientific data. So this is something that I think scientists often say we want to hear from the community about what is important, But what I don't think we've done historically at all is really value community voices and lived experiences on the same level as scientific data. So like I said, we just wrapped up the Pasadena Healthy Parks Plan. And so this is a project where at a regional scale, at a city scale, we looked at over 60 different variables in 4 different indices. So socioeconomic vulnerability, health disparities, park access, and environmental risk and vulnerability, and layered all of those, weighted them based on community feedback so we understood the unique context of Pasadena, and came up with this priority map to really identify what locations in Pasadena would have the most impact if we invested in existing parks to improve them, or if we invested in new parks. And so now that we've determined where to invest in parks, then we also developed this Healthy Park Design Guidelines toolkit that really looked at what tools are available to help us design our parks better. And so we know where we're gonna have the most impact, and now we know how we can have an impact on health. And something I wanna point out on this toolkit example is that not only are we calling out the health benefits and citing peer-reviewed literature when we're talking about those benefits, but we're also calling out direct community feedback that we heard to help inform the reason why we included water recreation, for instance, as one of those toolkit items. Another example at a site scale is a project up in Austin called the Central Williamson Creek Greenway. And so this is a project that we were brought on by the Nature Conservancy, by Jaime's counterpart in Austin, and working with community and technical stakeholders. So there's a technical stakeholder committee and there's a community stakeholder committee in this section of future greenway along Williamson Creek in South Austin. And what you can see in this image is that there's a lot of buyout areas. There's a lot of emotion around places where people used to live, raise families, be connected to that space. And so people have been displaced because of buyouts. Existing community members are really passionate about what this space can be. And so instead of having a traditional design process that really just said, tell us what you want and we'll go back to the drawing board and we'll design everything and then you can tell us if we got it right. Instead, on this, we've asked folks what they want, but then we've helped to develop these toolkits for different potential design features on this greenway that look at how they might meet different guiding principles that we co-created with those community groups, and how they might be phased in, what the relative cost might be, what other features might complement them. And this really democratized this design process for community to be able to have more agency in process. Number 4, stacking benefits and rejecting binary thinking. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this binary thinking for a minute. So I wish I could see hands raised, but how many times have we said, have we talked about conservation and development as 2 opposing forces? So that's an example of binary thinking. Black versus white, development versus nature. That kind of thinking is not going to get us where we need to go. And stacking benefits is one of the ways that we can get over that binary thinking. So one of the examples I like to use is functional green. This is not something we worked on, but something I interacted with as an environmental commissioner in the city of Austin. And this is really looking at how in our most urban places in Austin, we can layer in more green features. And so this is an ecosystem service-based metric where developers who are developing in the most commercial places have to be able to show that they're meeting a minimum score on this ecosystem service-based metric in order to get their development permits approved. And what is cool about this is that it's been verified that even some developments prior to this being a requirement, we're still meeting that minimum score. So it's not a burden. It's already happening in the market. But it's something that we want to start to incentivize more and more and regulate more and more so that we expect better design in the city. 5, we need to ensure that systems are dynamic and adaptable. So one example of this is Gene Green Park in Houston. So this is something we designed a long time ago, and it's great because we can actually see what it looks like built out. These graphics on the bottom were really meant to show how this park is being designed to be used 360 days a year for all of these different recreational programs and opportunities to gather with community. But on the days when it needs to detain water, it can. And so you can see a normal flooding season, a heavy flooding season, and then you can see it actually in practice in the images on the top. So this is a great example of how we can be more adaptable and dynamic in our design. And then I have 2 left. 6 is we need to acknowledge trauma associated with change. So if you felt some discomfort earlier when I was talking about how we need to be empathetic to folks coming in and saying, here's how you could do your work differently. Here's how you can do this science differently. Here's how you can do this conservation work differently. That is because we are all resistant to change, as inevitable as it's going to be. So I also want to acknowledge that climate change and gentrification and all of these larger scale changes are traumas that I think we need to also approach empathetically. So there's a lot of articles about the connection between mental health and climate. This is my favorite quote that really speaks to kind of the irony of how we as humans think about change. So what a predicament. We seem doomed to suffer simply because we have a deep-seated fear of how things really are. Our attempts to find lasting pleasure, lasting security are at odds with the fact that we're part of a dynamic system in which everything and everyone is in process. So what does that look like? What does that look like in terms of being empathetic for folks dealing with change? So this is the North Houston Livable Centers project that we worked on with Hewitt Zollers. The image on the right shows really the opportunity for this huge amount of floodplain in Greens Point in North Houston to really serve as this large-scale regional connector and refuge of ecological space. But then the image on the left shows a huge amount of multifamily, single family, some areas that have already been bought out, but people who have this connection to place. And the way we framed discussions around the future of this space needed to be centered in honoring those lived experiences of trauma, of climate trauma in this space for folks who have repeatedly been flooded, way before we ever start talking about the ecological benefits of what this space could be in 10 years, in 20 years. And so that's also something that we try to think about is what is the human experience first? All right, this last one. We need to include equity as a core driver. So this isn't just a potential benefit, but a core driver, and Jaime spoke to this a little bit. So part of the reason that I feel responsible for doing this is because I know fundamentally that ecological change is never socially neutral. So if we do green infrastructure work in Houston or New Orleans, and we remove some flood risk, that also has the potential to increase property values and potentially displace folks. And so that's just one example of many about how these systems are so inextricably connected that I feel absolutely responsible for thinking about how we can do work that thinks holistically. So we've kind of been thinking about equity in 3 different ways. This is most of how we've been doing it in recent times. So when we're doing any kind of policy planning, design, implementation work, we've been thinking of equity as a co-benefit. So if we can fit it in, we'll do it. If it's something that presents itself, we'll do it, but it's never going to be at the expense of the core goal. So we're not going to change our conservation plans just because we can't fit equity in. But sure, if we can fit it in, that would be great. So that's where we've been. Some folks are starting to get here, equity as a lens. So in our planning and design, our work that we're doing, how can we make sure that we're looking through that equity lens so that we understand all the externalities, the positive and the negative benefits of our decisions, and then maybe even still weigh things in the balance and override equity goals for other goals. But I think this is a little bit more of an eyes open, but still making decisions that pit equity against other priorities. And this last one is where I think we need to get, especially if we want to do this work differently, if we want to change the outcomes of what's happening in our cities. So this is equity as a core driver. This is basically saying that if there are not positive, or at least neutral, but positive equity benefits of an action, whether it's a conservation or a climate or a resilience action, then it is not meeting our requirements for success. So what's next for Houston? How does this all relate to the moonshot? So this idea of ditching the silos is really about how we can bring other folks with different lived experiences and different disciplines to the table for conversations around the future of conservation across an urban to rural gradient. How do we use systems thinking? Again, this is not just about the ecological systems we're promoting, but it's about the social and economic systems. And again, it's urban to rural, and it's everything from a front yard habitat to a regional network of green. How do we balance community voice and scientific data? Sorry about that. Community voice and scientific data. And again, this is about how we value feedback, how we value community voice and lived experiences on the same level as scientific data. How we stack benefits has to do with, how we integrate these ecosystem services into our expectations for any design, any plan, and reject binary thinking as a part of how we can do this process differently, but also how we can stack those benefits. We need to ensure systems are dynamic because climate is changing. Acknowledge trauma associated with change because that's how we're going to have an empathetic process. And I think we need to include equity as a core driver. If we don't have positive equity outcomes, then we will not have positive conservation outcomes in the long term. So just a little bit more about the moonshot. We're just about to kick off phase 1. And so this goes through March. And what we're really doing here is understanding, exploring, and reporting back. And so these are going to include some initial conversations with folks in the explore phase. We're going to do some focus groups, really develop our team of champions in the region, and again, bring new folks into the fold. The understand phase is really about doing a really comprehensive look at any existing conservation and planning documents relevant to the moonshot, including Resilient Houston, including the Climate Action Plan, including the work that's been happening around public health and One Health. And then we're going to report that back to help inform what we do in phase 2 to really bring this conversation to a larger stage, to learn from other cities. So this number 5 scope is really looking at how we can pull in places like maybe LA or Chicago, and also places like Singapore or Barcelona, who are really doing some cool thinking around how we can integrate ecological change and ecological resilience into cities in a way that has equitable outcomes. And then our final goal of this phase 2 is really convening a regional summit on what this looks like once we've done all this homework, once we've learned from other places, and that's where we're trying to get. And my grandma loved the show that this quote is from, "To the moon, Alice," is where we're headed. So that's kind of the outline of what this Houston Conservation Moonshot is going to look like. Like I said, phase 1 is through March, and I know I'm running up on my time, so I want to make sure if we have questions, I have time to do those. And then my contact information is right here. Thanks.
Katie, awesome. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, have you seen what kind of either resistance or acceptance have you seen in this idea of, you called it stacking of what I would term design criteria. Do you see clients or jurisdictions feeling like, no, this is the way we've always done it, or hey, look, a new way of thinking about it, and that's really going to get us a result that we haven't seen before? What's your read on that?
It's funny because it's a technical question, but it's an empathy question too. So it's, part of it has to do with it's going to cost more to maintain. We don't know how to maintain. It's some change management that you need to do with parks departments, for instance, who want to start integrating more green infrastructure into their parks. And so I think approaching those conversations empathetically is important, but also using science to back up the idea that for the most part, in the long term, green infrastructure systems are less expensive than gray infrastructure systems. And also obviously have all these co-benefits. And so when you treat it as a win-win, and then you also empathetically approach how you can change the way we operate, even in a maintenance team, then that's I think that's a key piece of the way we can do this work differently. And from what I hear, actually, I just heard recently that the city of Houston is going to start training some maintenance teams to be able to do more maintenance of green infrastructure in the city. So that's really exciting. You know, that work is already starting to happen.
And so you've seen some experiences in other cities, other metropolitan areas. How would you compare what you've witnessed as far as both implementation and planning in other jurisdictions versus what we're doing here in the greater Houston region?
Well, I think my easiest comparison is Austin and Houston, because that's where I have most of my work. And I really split my time between the two. And I think Houston has done a really good job of bringing together and thinking like a big city. And Austin doesn't quite know that Austin is a big city yet. We kind of still have a small city mentality. But you have a lot of funding to go into this work, and much more so, and in deep pockets in philanthropy that can help fund really interesting work. And I think, actually, just speaking to the last question, we've had luck furthering these goals, but through the lens of health, because we've been able to articulate the health benefits, and then folks who normally fund health work or health-focused planning work are able to help fund work that has multiple goals, including ecological goals. So, you know, I think in Houston, there's a lot of financial capacity, it seems, to further this work. But in Austin, I think there's much more of a community-minded perspective on how we can really allow community leaders to really have agency in the outcomes of what's going to happen in their community. So we just finished our update to our climate plan, and we actually named it the Climate Equity Plan this year because of how equity is really a core driver in that process. There's not a recommendation in that doesn't have some implications for positive equity outcomes. And so that's kind of that last diagram. But Houston hasn't quite figured out how to fully trust and honor community voice, I think. And I think that's pretty vital next step if we're going to do equitable work. We really value business and corporate voice. Not quite the community voice very much.
I think your insights fit what I've observed as well. So, Katie, thank you very much for your presentation and your comments today. Appreciate you being with us. I think it's a perfect setup for our last speaker of the day. But first, we're going to take another bio break where you can get up, stretch, step away from the screen for a few minutes. And we're once again going to be showing some videos from our sponsors during the break. Again, this is a 5-minute break before Dr. Kleinberg joins us. So you'll definitely want to be back at your screen at, let's say, 11:07. Thank you very much. See you soon.
We are the scientists, the planners, the technical specialists, and the creative thinkers.
Our 100% employee-owned firm offers a range of environmental compliance services combined with local knowledge, regulatory expertise, and high-quality service.
We're committed to preserving our natural and cultural resources, giving back to our communities, and prioritizing safety both in the field and the office.
With a nationwide presence that has been growing since 1981, we remain one.
We are SWCA.
SWCA.
We are SWCA.
EHRA Engineering prides itself on a long-standing history of delivering exceptional solutions. Founded in 1936, what began as serving land developers with paving, drainage, and utility design has since expanded to adapt to the ever-changing needs of the communities we serve. As a multidisciplinary civil engineering firm, we provide a comprehensive approach to meet the demands of our growing region as we maintain our mission of engineering the future. EHRA is proud to support the Bayou Preservation Association's 17th Annual Symposium.
We are the scientists, the planners, the technical specialists, and the creative thinkers.
Our 100% employee-owned firm offers a range of environmental compliance services combined with local knowledge, regulatory expertise, and high-quality service.
We're committed to preserving our natural and cultural resources, giving back to our communities, and prioritizing safety both in the field and the office.
With a nationwide presence that has been growing since 1981, we remain one.
We are SWCA.
SWCA.
We are SWCA.
Welcome back, everyone. We are going to head for our final presentation of our first day of our symposium. And I see Dr. Kleinberg on screen. We got your audio. Audio's all working? All right.
The PowerPoints?
There we go. We're good. So Dr. Kleinberg has joined us here at the symposium several previous occasions, and we thought with this year's theme, we had to bring him back. I don't know whether you know his new book that came out this year, which we're actually giving away as a gift to all of our speakers today, as a matter of fact. The book is titled Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. And it coalesces about 40 years of research, and his presentation today should be very telling about where we've been, where we're heading, what example Houston sets. And we are very privileged to once again have Dr. Kleinberg with us. And I believe he is ready. Are you?
I think so. Chris, how are you? Can
There
you
we
hear
go.
me and see me?
Yes, we can hear you, and we've got your slides, so you are ready to go, sir.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you guys very much for inviting me to be here. This, you know, it is a remarkable city, and the work that the Bayou Preservation Association is doing is just so central to building the Houston that can succeed in the very different world of the 21st century. So I thought it might be useful for me just to remind you of the remarkable changes, right? We did a one-time survey back in 1982. Houston was booming. 1 million people had moved into the city between 1970 and 1982. 80% of the jobs in Houston were tied into the price of oil. Price of oil increased tenfold in value between 1970 and 1982. Booming America. It was also a city, of course, world famous for having imposed the least amount of controls on development of any city in the Western world. Who cares if it's ugly? So what if it smells? It's a smell of money. Come on down. So we did a one-time survey to measure how are people balancing this incredible growth with growing concerns about pollution, traffic, crime. What kind of city are we building with this affluence? One-time survey, never occurred to us to do it again. 2 months later, the oil boom collapsed. Price of oil had gone to from $3.20 to $35.60 in 1982. We were building and borrowing on the basis of $50 oil. Suddenly, the price of oil fell to $28. 100,000 jobs were lost in Houston by the end of 1983. We said, we better do this survey again. And for 39 years, asking a representative random sample of Harris County residents, reached by random telephone numbers, 50% landline, 50% cell phone, asking people with identical questions over the years, how do you see the world? And we have sat back and watched the world change. So let me just remind us, Houston went into major recession with the collapse of the oil boom and then recovered into a restructured economy and a demographic revolution. 3 central themes. Oh, no, hold on, I'm sorry. Okay. 3 central, let me move this, there we go. With the rise of the knowledge economy, the good blue-collar jobs have disappeared, growing inequalities across the board in Houston and America, predicated above all else on access to quality education. A truly epic transformation. Oh, no, this is not working here now. An epic transformation to the demographic patterns and characteristics of Houston, Texas, and America. A fundamental transformation in the ethnic composition of America. Why here? Why now? And thirdly, and critically, the new importance of quality of place. If Houston's going to make it, it has to become a destination of choice, a place where the best and the brightest people in America who can live anywhere will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. So those are the 3 big themes. Let me just touch on them quickly, suggest, A, why are they happening? And B, how are people dealing with and responding to the challenges that they represent? The new economy. Here is the 30 years after World War II. We emerged out of that war, the sole economic power on the planet. All of our potential competitors were decimated by the war experience. This was a world of big business, big government, big labor. 38% of all the jobs in America in 1960, 38% of all the jobs were union jobs. The unions could negotiate with the corporations to ensure that workers shared in the prosperity of the companies. The rising tide lifted all boats. The poorest 20% of American families between 1950 and 1970 literally doubled their incomes in real terms. Big employers in Houston in the 1970s was Hughes Tool Company, Cameron Iron Works, good blue-collar jobs for some of the strong right arm of Williams to work hard. Those were the years between 1946 and 1964 when we celebrated the stay-at-home housewife mother in suburbia, the average American woman. Between 1946 and 1964, the average American woman gave birth to 3.6 children on average. And the baby boom was launched upon the land, preceded and followed by baby bust generation. So for 60 years, there's been a bulge going through the American system. Demographers talk about it like a pig being swallowed by a python. Not very comfortable either for the pig or the python. The leading edge of those 76 million babies, overwhelmingly Anglo babies. That's who was here to be born in that period after World War II. The leading edge of those 76 million turned 74 this year. And we are going to watch a literal doubling of the number of Americans over the age of 65 in the next 25 years. And between now and 2030, every day, day after day, believe it or not, 10,000 Americans every day will turn 65. And by 2030, the youngest of the 76 million will have turned 65, heading off into the proverbial sunset, not right away, but eventually, being replaced by a very different generation of Americans. It is one of the central epic transformations of our time, brought about by that remarkable broad-based prosperity in the 30 years after World War II. Here is what has happened in the last 35 years, when virtually all the benefits of economic growth have gone to the richest 20%, most of that to the richest 5%, most of that to the richest 1%. The bottom 60% of American families who had experienced a doubling in their incomes in the 30 years after World War II experienced basically a stagnation in their income. No improvement over those 35 years. All a remarkable redistribution of earnings out of the hands of the poor and the middle class into the hands of the rich and the super rich in a way that we have never seen before in American history, with the sole exception of 1929, just after the Roaring '20s and before the total collapse of the American economy. What happened? Why did the economy change so profoundly? Two big things happened, and then a total failure on the part of our political systems to address these issues, to raise the minimum wage, to ensure access to quality education. Two big things happened. Number one, globalization. Companies can produce goods anywhere, sell them everywhere. If you are doing a job that I can train a third world worker to do, and I pay that third world worker $15 a day to do the job, I'm not going to pay you $15 an hour. And if you are doing a job that I can program a computer to do, we're just at the beginnings of the robotics revolution, I'm going to replace your job with an intelligent machine. We are in a new world where education, always a nice thing to have, has become absolutely essential to a person's ability to earn enough money to support a family in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century. And it's a tremendous challenge, especially for Houston and Texas, because we are at the bottom in our spending on education. You didn't need education to make money in Texas. The big Texas fortunes were made from cotton, timber, cattle, sugar, oil. The source of wealth in the 21st century will have less and less to do with natural resources, which was a basis for the wealth of Houston and Texas, and more to do with human resources, with knowledge and skills. And so this is one of the central themes of the 21st century, and one of the central challenges that Houston faces. Here's a quick example of what's going on here. This is the educational requirements for jobs across America, compiled by the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. In the 1970s, there were 91 million jobs in this country. 1/3 of those jobs you were eligible for as a high school dropout. Another 40% required no more than high school. 2/3 of all the jobs in America in the 1970s required education, high school education or less. And here's what's happened to the jobs since then. And by 2020, by the end of this year, the estimates are 65% of all the jobs that will exist in America will require education beyond high school. Not necessarily 4 years of college, but 1 or 2 years in a community college to acquire the technical skills that the new economy requires. 14 years of education is now the minimum that we have to make sure everybody has access to. And it is a fundamental transformation that has occurred across the board in America, and particularly in Houston. We've been watching attitudes toward education change over the years. Here's a sea change that has occurred. Again, I tell people, don't blame me, I'm just asking the questions. Here are the answers. So the question that we asked starting in the 1990s, which comes closest to your opinion about the public schools in Houston? The schools have enough money, if it was used wisely, to provide a quality education, or the schools will need significantly more money if it was used wisely. That's what we believed through the 1990s. Schools have all the money they need, it's being wasted. But minorities, only 38 and 37% thought more money will be needed to provide quality education in today's world. During the first decade of the 21st century, it was a 50-50 split. We came back 10 years later in 2018, and now 55% said the schools will need significantly more money. Came back 2 years later to check it, 55% to just 39%. Schools will need significantly more money in order to provide a quality education. This is a sea change in the general public's understanding and readiness, perhaps, to truly address these issues as we go forward. Here was another example that surprised us. Question we first asked in 2018, are you in favor or opposed to increasing local taxes in order to provide universal preschool education for all children in Houston? And to our surprise, 67% said yes, increase local taxes to provide universal preschool education. Came back 2 years later, and it's now 70%. Only 28% saying we need to increase local taxes to provide universal preschool education. The public has understood this. One of the moments of truth in American education is third grade reading. If you're not reading at the third grade level in third grade, you are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. And the single most powerful predictor whether you can read at third grade level is, did you start kindergarten ready to learn to read? And rich kids in Houston start kindergarten 1.5 to 2 years ahead of poor kids. The gap continues to expand. The brain is growing by 60% between birth and kindergarten. That's when synapses are forming, and it is the single best investment you can make in education is early preschool childhood, early childhood education that sets the stage for the learning process that will be the basis for success as the 21st century unfolds. And the growing inequalities in Houston are palpable, and they come particularly from the deep inequalities in access to quality education. Here are just some examples of the inequalities. In the survey in 2019, we said, supposing you had an emergency expense and you needed to come up with $400 to meet that emergency expense, how would you deal with the situation? Would you be able to pay for it out of savings? Would you need to borrow it? Or would you not be able to come up with $400? And 40%, 39% in our surveys last year said they could not come up with $400, living on the edge of bankruptcy and catastrophe. Houston has, of course, the greatest medical complex in the world in the Texas Medical Center, 100,000 people working there, 49 different institutions, world class is the place. We have the greatest medical structures in the world, and Houston has the highest percentage of children without health insurance of any major city in America. 1/4 of all Houstonians have no health insurance whatsoever. 30% are making do on household incomes of less than $37,500 a year. 35% had said they had difficulty paying for the groceries to feed their families, and another 35% said they had difficulty paying for housing to support, to provide the shelter that they need. Deep inequalities, central, unsustainable realities that are a part of the Houston makeup today that critically need to be addressed. And the pandemic, of course, and we're in the midst of now, has only underlined and made much clearer even the deep vulnerabilities of African American Latinos in this city, particularly in the face of the pandemic. And the public is increasingly understanding that people are poor through circumstances they can't control. Here's again, an example of a series of questions we've asked over the years. Government should take action to reduce income differences between rich and poor in America. 45% agreed with that statement in 2010, 61% in 2020. The government should see to it that everyone who wants to work can find a job, going from 64% to 79%. Do you think most people who are receiving welfare benefits are really in need of help, or are they taking advantage of the system? The percent who said they're really in need of help went from 31% to 47%. They're not taking advantage of the system. And are you in favor of opposed to federal health insurance to cover the medical costs of all Americans, growing from 60 to 72%? So theme number 1, growing inequalities in Houston and Texas and America, predicated above all else on access to quality education and all the support systems that we need to help kids succeed, starting from birth to college, from cradle to career. Theme number 1, growing inequalities predicated above all else on access to quality education. Theme number 2, this remarkable, fundamental, irreversible transformation in the ethnic composition of the Houston, the Texas, and the American population. Why here? Why now? Why is this happening? Here's a quick history lesson. Right? This is the number of documented immigrants coming to America in each of the decades from 1820 through 2010. And here's a big part of the story. So, excuse me a second. Big part of the story, right, is that between 1492 and 1965, 82% of all the immigrants who came to American shores 82% of us came from Europe. Another 12% were Africans originally brought here as slaves to serve the Europeans. There was a handful of Chinese and Japanese working as farmers and laborers in California and Hawaii. This nation was an amalgam of European nationalities, deliberately so. In the last 40 years of that period, between 1924 and 1965, we were operating under one of the most viciously racist laws the US Congress ever passed, the National Origins Quota Act. And it came out of the great anti-immigrant racist backlash that accompanied the last great wave of immigration, when 15.9 million immigrants came to America between 1890 and 1914. Coming from Europe, but not coming from Northern Europe. They were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they weren't Protestants, they were Catholics and Jews, and they had no history of democracy. They're coming to take our jobs, destroy our country. We've got to stop them. In 1924, we enacted this incredible act that said, all right, from now on, only Northern Europeans will be allowed to come to America. We used a new science of psychology and the IQ test to declare in the act, science has proven that there are 3 subspecies of the white race. The Nordics, who are biologically and intellectually superior to the Alpines, who in turn are superior to the Mediterraneans, and all of them are superior to the Jews and the Asians. And the law codified the Chinese Exclusion Act in California of 1882, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan of 1906, to declare in the act, Asians are an inferior subspecies of humanity, ineligible from ever becoming American citizens, and Asians were banned entirely from coming to America. Isn't that incredible? Coming out of the racist world, it was a law of the land through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. You can see what happens to immigration. It plummets. That's, of course, the Great Depression in the 1930s, followed by World War II, the terrible aftermath of World War II. We thought immigration had ended. The racist laws could not survive. The shifts of consciousness with the civil rights movements, Jack Kennedy's assassination. Kennedy was one of the great champions of immigration. The last book published after he was assassinated was entitled A Nation of Immigrants, a celebration of how much immigration had brought to America throughout its history. And in 1965, partly in tribute to him, Congress changed the law. Said, all right, we used to be a racist nation. We're not racist anymore. We'll give every nation recognized by the UN 20,000 visas a year, regardless of ethnicity. So get off my back. We're not racist. But we're going to continue the hallmark of American immigration policy, which is family reunification. We're in the business of reuniting families in our immigration policies. If you're the father, mother, sister, brother, son, or daughter of an American citizen, you can come to the head of the line. Therefore, said Congress, we think immigration has ended, but if it hasn't, we're giving preference to people related to those already here. So nothing will change except getting this deeply embarrassing law off the books. Then it added another provision. It said, well, if you're a professional of exceptional ability, you have skills that are demonstrably needed and in short supply, you too can come to the head of the line. And in its debates in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Congress was saying, we need to open the door for some more British doctors, some more German engineers. It never occurred to anyone that there were going to be African doctors, Indian engineers, Chinese computer programmers, Filipino nurses who would be able for the first time in the 20th century to come to America. The law was changed in 1965. It's been called one of the great inadvertent acts that the US Congress has ever passed in a body known for its inadvertent acts and its unintended consequences. We thought nothing would change. Everything changed. During the 1960s, 3.5 million immigrants came to America. Only 38% were from Europe. 1970s, 5 million came, only 18% were Europeans. 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, 10 million immigrants per decade have been coming to America. 88% of all the new immigrants coming since 1965 are coming from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. In the United States and throughout all of our history had been an amalgam of European nationalities, is rapidly becoming a microcosm of the world. The first nation in the history of the world that can say, we are a free people. Now we come from everywhere. It's a truly remarkable change. I mean, the same moment as American economy is becoming fully integrated in a single global world economic system, America, a microcosm of the world. Immigration, excuse me, of course, is network driven. You go where you know people, so it's not happening the same way everywhere. New York is, of course, the great immigration capital in terms of sheer numbers, followed by Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, followed right after Chicago by Houston, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and then Dallas, San Antonio, Boston, Atlanta, spreading now to every city and town across America. No city has been transformed as fully, as completely, as suddenly, as irreversibly as Houston, Texas. This city, throughout all of our history, was essentially a biracial southern city, dominated and controlled in an automatic, taken for granted way by white men. And in the space of the last 35 years, has become the single most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the entire country. Here are the figures. This is the census of 1960. This was our biracial world. There were 1.243 million people living in Harris County, Texas. 74% of us were Anglos, 20% African Americans, just 6% Hispanics, less than 0.5% were Asians. During the oil boom years of the 60s and 70s, it was Anglos pouring into Houston from everywhere else in the country. This is where the jobs were. By 1980, Houston became the 4th largest city in America, still an overwhelmingly Anglo city. After the oil bust of 1982, the Anglo population of Harris County stopped growing. And all the growth of this, the most rapidly growing city in America, has been the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. Here are the 3 completed censuses from 1990, 2000, and 2010. You can see the Anglo population stabilizing and then dropping slightly. African American population keeping pace with the population as a whole, growing by about 20% per decade, fueled by African and Jamaican immigration, fueled by the great remigration of middle-class African Americans who go into northern cities in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, coming back to southern cities, Atlanta first, Houston second, African American population keeping pace, and surging populations of Latinos and Asians. And the latest estimates from the census is that Harris County is now 42% Hispanic, 31% Anglo, 19% African American, 8% Asian. Wow. No city in human history has been transformed as rapidly, as fully, as completely, as irreversibly as Houston, Texas. Just imagine how different the story of Houston would have been had we not become a magnet for the new immigration of the last 35 years. Houston would have lost population. We would have had the same fate as other major American cities across the country that are losing their status as major cities because for 35 years, they've essentially stopped growing. Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Baltimore, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Buffalo. Instead, Houston is one of the most vibrant, rapidly growing cities in America, tremendous entrepreneurial economy, last city to go in this recession, the first one to come out, purely because of the tremendous energy, vitality, commitment to hard work of immigrants pouring into the city from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. No city has benefited more from immigration than Houston, Texas. And it's ironic, but I guess not surprising to see the anti-immigrant attitudes in Houston when you think how different the story of Houston would have been had we been like Philadelphia as we were in 1982. For one reason or another, Philadelphia never became the magnet that Houston became for the new urban growth of America in the 21st century. Here's a quick way to envision this. This is Harris County in 1980. There are 1,320 census tracts in Harris County, and in blue are all the census tracts that had majority Anglo populations. In red was the African American corridor, the 3rd ward and the 5th ward, that had majority African American populations. Along the ship channel was the Segundo Barrio where the Latinos were, and then a few places around the Beltway in 1980 in that olive color census tracts with no majority. Here's 1990, 2000, 2010. Isn't that incredible? No one consulted with me before all these people came. Houston finds itself, whether it would have chosen it or not, to be at the forefront of what's happening across all of America. Nowhere more clearly seen or more sharply articulated than in Houston, Texas. And here's why we make the claim that Houston is the most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the country. How do you measure the ethnic diversity of a population? 2 standard ways. One is just simply what's the population of Anglos? The fewer Anglos, the more diverse. A better, richer measure is what's called the entropy index. How close does a population come to equal force? 1/4 Asian, 1/4 Hispanic, 1/4 African American, 1/4 Anglo. And by that measure, Houston just beats out New York to be the most ethnically diverse, by that measure, of every metropolitan area in the country. Here's Houston. Here are the other 7 most diverse large metro areas across America. One thing to note right away is that all the successful metros are ones that have been magnets for the new immigration that has transformed America, especially American cities, during the last 35 years. But Los Angeles has too few proportionally of African Americans. Chicago has too many Anglos. Miami has way too few Asians. Houston is where the four communities meet. Greater balance, greater equality, all of us minorities, all of us called on to build something that has never existed before in human history. A truly successful, inclusive, equitable, united, multi-ethnic society made up of all the peoples, all the religions, all the ethnicities of the world gathered together in one remarkable place. It is the story of Houston in the 21st century. And it's not just numbers, of course, it's also ages. So this brings me back to the baby boom we talked about. So let's see, I've got babies on the left, I've got old people on the right, I've got 12 different age categories from under the age of 5 to 75 years old or older. And here, according to the latest census, is where the Anglos are in Harris County, Texas today. Ladies and gentlemen, the baby boom. It's not until you reach people in Harris County age 63 and older that the majority of folks are still Anglos. And at each younger age group, the percentage of Anglos plummets. The percentage of African Americans, Asians, and above all Latinos surges. Here's where everybody else is, in Harris County, Texas today. So this is a powerful picture of Houston's present and future, of everybody in Harris County, not HISD, not inner city Houston, of all the 4.8 million people in Harris County, of the 1.2 million who are under the age of 20, who will be the voters and taxpayers and workers and citizens of Houston in the 21st century, of everybody under the age of 20 across Harris County, 51% are Latinos, 19% are African Americans, 9% are Asians, 21% of everybody under 20 is Anglo. So two big things to say here, right? Number one, wow, 70% of everybody in Harris County under the age of 20 is African American and Latino. The two groups overwhelmingly, the most likely to be living in poverty. We know what poverty does to your ability to succeed in the public school system. It is a safe statement to make. And if Houston's African American and Latino young people are unprepared to succeed in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century, it is hard to envision a prosperous future for Houston. That is who we are and will be as the 21st century unfolds. The other point to make is that this is a done deal. Close the borders, build your fence, close off America, round up those 10 million people you think are here illegally and send them wherever you think they're supposed to go. Seal off this country so not another immigrant or refugee ever again will be allowed to set foot on our land. Sorry, guys, nothing's going to, 63-year-old Anglos are not going to be making a whole lot more babies. Sorry, my phone keeps ringing here. You can go to the bank on this, right? No conceivable force in the world is going to stop Houston or Texas or America from becoming more African American, more Asian, more Latino, and less Anglo as the 21st century unfolds. Nothing in the world can stop that. The only question our generation has been given is, okay, how do we make this work? How do we ensure that this diversity becomes the tremendous asset that can be as we position ourselves in the global economy, the gateway to the global marketplace, second largest port in the country, the 16th largest port on the planet, the gateway to building the relationships across this global economy of ours, and make sure it doesn't end up tearing us apart and becoming a major liability, reducing rather than enhancing our competitiveness in the global economy. This is Houston's story. This is the question. The only question our generation has been given is, how do we make this work? How do we ensure that this becomes the diversity, the tremendous asset that it can be in the 21st century? Much depends on how this generation speaks of this remarkable convergence of the two forces that have transformed the 21st century in our lifetimes. A new economy where education has now become critical, and a demographic revolution. So we have been, so here, before I leave the census, this is Houston today. Here is the United States today. Same pattern, same years, same aging of Anglos across the board, but still an Anglo country. And the census said 6 months after we got this data from them, all of our estimates now tell us, we'll know for sure when the 2020 survey census is completed, all of our estimates tell us of everybody across the entire country under the age of 9, aged 8 and younger, the majority of people across America, of children under 9, are African American, Latino, and Asian. He said, you want to know what America will look like in 2050? Let's assume no immigration and just go by those damn actuarial tables. Here's what they say America looks like in 2050. So this is very close to Houston today. It's almost identical to Texas today. It's fair to say how we in this city navigate this transition to build a truly successful, inclusive, multi-ethnic society will have enormous significance, not just for the Houston future, but for the American future. By 2050, all of America will look like Houston looks today. We are there first. This is where, for better or worse, the American story is going to be written. The American future is taking place here in Houston now. So what it makes, I think, all of our efforts as we address these issues of transcendent importance. This is not just Houston's future we're talking about. This is the American future. This is the model we can provide of what America can be as the 21st century unfolds, as all of America ends up looking the way Houston looks today. So we've been particularly interested, of course, in attitudes toward this ethnicity and how is it being experienced by Houstonians. Let me just show you very quickly before I get to the final story I want to tell. And get there as soon as possible. Here are measures of favorable feelings toward immigrant communities. Question we asked in 3 different years, do you agree or disagree refugees who are in danger in their home countries should always be welcome in Houston? 64% in 2016. That was incredibly high. We grew up further to 75 and to 77% in this year's survey. We said, okay, here's a 10-point scale where 1 means very unfavorable feelings and 10 means very favorable feelings. Where on this scale would you represent your feelings about undocumented immigrants? And the percent giving ratings of only 7 to 10 positive ratings went from 24% only in 2010 to 49% in this year's survey. And we said, well, how would you rate feelings about Muslims or followers of Islam, from 35% jumping to 60% in the survey this year? A growing embrace of this diversity, a growing sense that this is enriching all of us. And this is everybody. So let me show you just US born Anglos in the series of questions that we asked from 2010 okay, I didn't realize I still had this one in there. The measure of generalized trust. Do you think most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful in dealing with people? Went from 31 to 42%. How worried are you about being the victim of a crime is down lower than it's ever been before. What's the best penalty for people who are convicted of first-degree murder? Life in prison with no possibility of parole, life in prison with possibility of parole after 20 years, or the death penalty. Percent accepting the death penalty is down, again, lower than it's ever been. A greater comfort with this diversity. And then here are the questions we asked of Anglos only between 1994 and 2019. Do immigrants contribute more to the American economy than they take? Or do they take more than they contribute? Moving back and forth because the numbers are small, but the pattern is pretty significant, going from 30 and 29 to 48% in the 2019 survey. Do you think the increasing immigration into America today mostly strengthens American culture or mostly threatens American culture? Percent saying mostly strengthens American culture, went from 33% to 49%. And here's one more. Do you think the increasing ethnic diversity in Houston will eventually become a source of great strength for the city or a growing problem, going from 59 to 70%? All of our measures show us that we're increasingly embracing this diversity across the board. And the question is, why is that? Is it that Anglos are changing their minds over these years, or is it what sociologists call cohort secession? Is it that younger Anglos are coming into the world with different views than older Anglos? And the answer is it's a little bit of both, but it's much more cohort secession than it is baby boomers, for example, changing their minds. So here's how we measured 3 different cohorts. Those who were born in the 1960s, the end of the baby boom generation, those born in the 1970s, the Gen X generation, and those born in the 1980s, the beginnings of the millennial generation. and asking identical questions, all when they were ages 25 to 35, all US-born Harris County Anglos. And here's what you find. Increasing immigration strengthens American culture. Immigrants contribute more to the American economy. The U.S. should have been more or the same number of legal immigrants in the next 10 years as we were in the last 10. Every question we ask shows this pattern with age. Younger Anglos taking for granted what we older Anglos are struggling to accept. Here's one other indication of what we're talking about. We ask Anglos, and that's everybody, in this case, just Anglos. Have you ever been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who was not Anglo? Anglos under 40, 58, 61% said, thank you for asking. Yes, indeed, I have. Anglos 40 to 60, 52, 54%. And here it is for us older Anglos. I'm afraid the hearts are going to get a little smaller here. Powerful reminder that we older Anglos grew up in a different world. The world of the 1960s and 70s was a different place than the world of the 1990s and 2000s. There's a law of human nature that says what I am familiar with feels right and natural. What I'm unfamiliar with feels unnatural and somehow not quite right. As I say, every question we ask about comfort with diversity, support for immigration shows this pattern with Anglos, with age. It's not education, it's not gender, it's where you were born and what the world was like when you came of age. And this is a reminder also that we are watching people falling in love with each other, marrying, making multiracial babies. We're moving toward a world. Ethnicity and race, of course, remains enormously important, but increasingly in the 21st century, the great challenge for the future of America will not be so much an ethnic divide as a class divide across all the communities, access to quality education from birth to college, from cradle to career. Theme number 3. What will be the source of Houston's wealth in the 21st century? Houston's location in the East Texas oil fields accounted for everything. Houston's prosperity in the 20th century is going to account for less and less, and eventually for zilch. The source of Houston's wealth will have to do with biotech, right? With the great medical center, turning Houston into the third coast for the life sciences, along with San Francisco and Boston. It'll have to do with managing the energy transition as we move away from oil and gas into renewable energies and a low carbon future. It will have to do with the second largest port in the country, the gateway to the global marketplace. Above all, the resource of the knowledge economy is housed between the ears of the best and the brightest people in America who can live anywhere. And quality of life issues, never important for Houston. They say, who cares if it's ugly, so what if it smells? It becomes central to the pro-growth agenda for Houston in the 21st century. And you can see this is just a reminder how much we have done, and nowhere, I think, more powerfully than the work of Bayou Preservation. Just a reminder before we get to that, some of the wake-up calls. In October of 1999, Houston surpassed Los Angeles for the first time in history in the number of dangerously polluted days. The headline in the USA Today newspaper was, Houston, cough, cough, we've got a problem, cough, cough. On the LA Times was new smog capital of America declared. The business community had fought for 30 years against any efforts to reduce the petrochemical emissions, to clean the air. And then the Greater Houston Partnership, or the business community at the time, 6 months later formed something they called the BCCA, Business Coalition for Clean Air, recognizing that we've got to find a way to reduce the air pollution without hurting industry. And it was a powerful wake-up call. We're in a different place today. We're no longer the most polluted city in America. We're something like the 7th or 8th most polluted. Still serious problems with ozone and particulate matter, but doing much better. Another wake-up call. In September of 2002, Houston made a serious effort to become the host for the American city host for the 2012 Olympics. We were building a light rail that was going to connect downtown to the brand new sports arenas of Reliance Center. We were going to turn the Astrodome into the largest fully enclosed, totally air-conditioned track and field venue on the planet. We were opening new hotels and restaurants across the board. Got a great deal of kudos for wonderful planning in our bid to become the American city. And at the end of the day, Houston did not get a single vote. We went and we asked, what happened? How come? We did all these great things. And the answer they came back with was basically, Houston is ugly. Houston is nothing but billboards and freeways. We are not going to bring the world's people to this ugly city. Wake up call number 2. Houston is not nearly as ugly as it once was. And a big part of our understanding of Houston's future depends on becoming a city of choice, a destination for people who can live anywhere to say, I want to live in Houston. And the third is, of course, the issues of Harvey and flooding and how are we dealing with this as we work toward building a more resilient city. My favorite quote in all of this is John McHale, professor at the University of Houston many years ago, who said, it's not a question of alternatives to growth, but of alternative ways of growing. And here is, of course, the bayous, right? And this is the story of Houston. We are a bayou city. The bayous were concretized in the cheapest possible way by the Army Corps of Engineers during the 1960s and 70s. That's what we did down here. We got these bayous. They're of no value whatsoever. They're crummy creeks. Let's straighten them out, concretize them, get the water out of here as fast as possible. We voted, as you know, to build 150 miles of linear parks along all 9 of the major bayous in Houston. By the time the Bayou Greenways Initiative is completed, 60% of everybody living in the city of Houston will be within a mile and a half of a bayou trail. Houston will become one of the greenest cities in America. That would have been inconceivable, I think, 15 or 20 years ago. This is a city self-consciously aware that if it's going to be successful, it has to become a much greener, much more beautiful, much more attractive place to draw the best minds of the 21st century to come to work in Houston to help us reposition Houston for success in the knowledge economy of the 21st century. And here's one other quick thing I wanted to show you. I'm sorry, first, here's how we responded to hurricanes. We asked 3 questions after Harvey. Do you agree or disagree? It's almost certain that the Houston area will experience more severe storms in the next 10 years compared to the past 10. Right after Harvey, 76, then it was 75. Today, 77%. No change, a new awareness. We're going to experience more severe storms in the next 10 years. We better be ready. And are you in favor or opposed to prohibiting any additional construction in areas of Houston that have repeatedly flooded? 71% dropping to 56%. We don't believe in Houston with government telling you what you can do on your land. It's to our surprise coming back up to 65%. A new awareness that this is not ideological anymore. This is positioning Houston in a new world where floods are going to occur. And here's one other piece that shows that. 2 questions we've asked about climate change over the years. How serious a threat is climate change and global warming? Would you say it's a very serious problem, somewhat serious, or not much of a problem for, in America today? Every year, 39, 42, 40, it's 52, 51% of the survey this year saying it's a very serious problem. And then even more striking, we said, do you think climate change is primarily caused by human activities or by normal climate cycles? And the presenter said it's caused by human activities. Human beings are responsible. Human beings have to deal with this problem. Turn around, the trajectory was striking. 48 when we first asked that question in 2011, then 54, 58, 61, 65%. And the survey this year, 3 years after Harvey, 69% said climate change is primarily caused by human activities. We live in a new world, and the general public sees the world differently today than it did before, and more prepared than ever before to address these issues, to build the bayous as drainage for our flooding, but also as major amenities that enhance dramatically the value and richness of living in Houston. And then finally, one last thing I wanted to show you, this remarkable urban sprawl. Right? By some measures, Houston is the most spread out, the least dense, the most automobile-dependent city in all of America. This is a city of Houston that covers 600 square miles. There's a grand total of 2.2 million people. 600 square miles. You know how big that is? You could put inside the city limits of Houston, Texas, simultaneously, I kid you not, the cities of Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Philadelphia. Those 4 cities fit inside the city limits of Houston, Texas. They contain among them 5.5 million people. The city of Houston contains only 2.2 million. And then you go out to the greater Houston metropolitan area, the CMSA of Houston. Here is Harris County, of course. This is Fort Bend County, southwest of us. I forgot to mention Fort Bend County with Sugar Land, Missouri City, Fort Bend County is probably the most ethnically diverse major county on this planet. Fort Bend County today is 21% Asian, 20% African American, 24% Latino, 33% Anglo. You can't get much closer to one-fourth than that, right? And meanwhile, of course, Montgomery County is by some measures the third most Republican county in America. We incorporate all of them, but we cover in the greater Houston metropolitan area 10,000 square miles. That is almost as large as the entire state of Massachusetts and considerably larger than the state of New Jersey. This is the blob that ate East Texas. Houston was built on a crummy little bayou, 50 miles from any natural barrier in any direction, no mountains, no forests, no rivers, a developer's dream. Built by, for, and on behalf of the automobile, made possible by air conditioning, that we spread everywhere. We've created a civilization totally predicated on the automobile. We've been asking people in our surveys over the years, if you could live anywhere you wanted in Houston, what would you prefer? And we're watching a really remarkable shift in how we envision our lives in this city. We asked both neighborhoods and about homes, right? What kind of neighborhoods like to live in a single family residential area, which is where most of us live, or an area with a mix of developments, including homes, shops, and restaurants. And over the years, a 50-50 split. And we said, what kind of home would you like to live in? A single family home where you would, with a big yard where you would need to drive just about everywhere you want to go, or a smaller home in a more urbanized area within walking distance of shops and places. And here too, basically a 50-50 split. So this is no longer support for urban sprawl. And it's not that we don't like sprawl or don't like suburbs. And of course, Houston is now no longer a city and suburbs. It's a multi-centered metropolitan region with urban areas in the Woodlands and Sugarland and Montgomery City and so what this reflects, I think, is not anti-sprawl or anti-suburb. What it reflects is that we are a different folk today. In 1970, in the census of 1970, 2/3 of all American households had children living at home. You have children at home, they need green space, suburbs are forming, we're going out there to the suburbs to get green space and open big yards. In 2010 census, 1/3 of households had children at home. The census thinks when we complete our 2020 census, no more than about 1 in every 4 households in America will have children living at home. Whole bunches of us are empty nesters. The kids have grown up. I work downtown. I love the ballet, the symphony, and the opera. Do I have to walk? Do I have to drive 2 hours every day? Do I have to mow the lawn? Give me a choice, Houston. We're trying to attract the millennial creative class. Sociologists talk about the millennial generation, ages 20 to 30, as the postponing generation. They seem to be in no rush to have babies, to turn us into grandparents. When they have babies, they're going to have 1.6 rather than 3.6. They don't want to live out in the suburbs or in big sprawling areas. They want density, variety, walkability, bar hopping, all the things that only dense areas can provide. And the fastest growing age segment of the American population today are men and women over the age of 80. And we have not seen anything yet. As the baby boom turning 74 this year, 74 million of us move into senior status. I'm not sure I want all those 85-year-olds having to drive everywhere in Houston, Texas. So this is, along with other areas we've been touching on here, a basis for a serious self-conscious awareness that we need to reinvent ourselves. Rethink, what do we need to do to position Houston for success? And so in conclusion, research has documented significant changes. We're a different folk today than we were 5 years or 10 years ago. There are things that are possible politically today that were not possible 10 and 15 years ago. So survey respondents now increasingly acknowledge the need to improve the public schools, to spend more money on education, to redress the rising inequalities. Across the board, they're calling for new initiatives, as you've seen, to mitigate future storms and develop more walkable neighborhoods. And they are clearly, overwhelmingly, consistently embracing Houston's burgeoning diversity, feeling more positive about the continuing immigration. Across the board, even us old Anglos are moving in that direction. This is who we are. This is what Houston will be in the 21st century. We will be where all of America is going to be. And so the real question is, whether the business and civic leaders of the city can work together to build on these attitude changes and make the sustained commitments needed for prosperity in this new era of economic, demographic, and technological transformation, as the region copes with the triple whammy now that we're facing with the health pandemic, the economic shutdown, the collapse of oil prices, the deepening concerns about racial injustice. It's good to be reminded of the way area residents have changed in their broader concerns and their support for longer term investments that will ultimately determine Houston's and America's future. So I tell people, stay tuned. We're going back in the field to measure the impact of all of the last interview we did in the 2020 survey was completed on March 12th, and on March 16th of this year, the pandemic hit. So we have a year to ask identical questions and see how we've been changed by this process, by this pandemic, and how are we still, and to what degree are we still building on these broader concerns that will be critical in building this Houston of the 21st century. Please download the 2020 report at kinder.rice.edu. Buy a copy of the book, finally out, called Prophetic City, as we saw. It's a city that is maybe the most interesting and consequential city in America. Who knew? No one planned this. Here we are. This is what it means to be in Houston today. This is a challenge and an enormous opportunity that we have to build a city prepared to be a model for what all of America can become in the 21st century. Thank you all so much. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you. Sorry I talked too long. Looking forward if we have time for your questions and thoughts. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Kleinberg. We do have, we're right up against our time, but I think that we can entertain just a couple of questions that have been put in during the day. Stephen, if you can see where your camera is, you might want to turn that back on so everyone can see you now that the presentation's over. So one of the questions that came in was an interesting one to me, was about explaining what does this seemingly what's the difference between the seemingly progressive survey responses to Texas's conservative voting patterns? Stephen, I think you muted yourself. There you are.
Okay, unmuted. There, okay.
There you go. We got you.
Great question, as I said. It is the story of Houston, right? The difference between public opinion, which is what we measure when we ask a representative random sample of all of us in the privacy of their homes, how do you see the world? And politically effective opinion. Who votes? Who controls the political apparatus? Who makes contributions to the campaigns? Who feels strongly about these issues enough to say, I'm going to vote for this and pour my money into it? The last time there was the kind of inequality in America that we see today was in 1929, as I mentioned. The great jurist, I'm sorry, it'll come back in just a sec. Louis Brandeis, one of the great jurists of the time, said we can have concentrated wealth in the hands of the few, or we can have democracy. We cannot have both. And that's a big part of the challenge. The money's, the donor class, that has a lot to do with who votes and who translates those attitudes into action. But in a democracy, ultimately, public opinion will out. And as we see these secular changes, I think you can see already in this campaign going on right now, there's been a shift that's going to be translated to some degree, at least in political realities as we go forward.
Yeah, it's likely true. One of the other questions, and I think I have an answer to this, somebody was asking about comparison of Houston to other cities where predominantly public transportation is a way of getting around, and we don't necessarily believe that here. And I think it's the time of the decade at which Houston grew the most, during that kind of car culture, when there was this expanse of here's the American dream, and you can buy it here, and we have the roads that you can use to drive your brand new shiny car on. Is that, you think that's accurate, that we kind of grew at the right time when automobiles became the preferred mode of transit?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the story of Houston. And we grew with no natural barriers, 50 miles from the ocean, nothing, right? So we in Phoenix are the two most automobile dependent cities in America. But growing awareness, growing interest in alternatives, growing recognition you can't build enough roads to enhance traffic. You know, someone said that trying to solve the traffic problems by building more roads is like trying to deal with your weight problem by buying a bigger pair of pants. It gives you a little bit of relief for a little while. It doesn't get to the heart of the problem. You can see Houston has an enormous challenge because we are so spread out and we go in so many different directions. And 72% of all commutes happen from one suburb to another rather than from suburb into city. But we're moving in that direction in a variety of ways. And the bayou trails that provide new safe ways of getting around by bicycle and jogging and Uber is going to give us more flexibilities. There's a sense that it's going to be a whole variety of different modes that we will have access to that will enhance transportation and mobility, and the car will continue to be a part of it, but only a part. And we're going to see that develop as you get more density in these multi-centered metropolitan areas, 8 to 10 activity centers in the greater Houston metropolitan area that are as large as downtown San Diego in terms of workplaces and stuff. That's where you're going to see density and walkability. You already see it in the town centers of the Woodlands and Sugar Land. That's the sort of thing I think we're going to see, a much greater mix of modes of transportation as we go forward.
And I think finally, something that really struck me in your presentation was this idea that a third grade reading level is the key to practically everything that we need to have a successful future. So is that an understanding on the part of educators or school districts that, you know, are we reaching students in the right way? And I know there's certain districts, specifically in the outliers of Harris County, that have been overwhelmed by Hispanic populations. And, you know, do we have a teaching base that is capable of handling this and getting that base level of education so that we can get students into those next, you know, into junior high, into college, so that we can have that successful culture in the future?
Right. I mean, that's the great question. I end the book with a statement: the jury is out. It's not. There's a new understanding in Houston of the critical importance of education. The fact that there are no. You graduate from high school, and if you don't have special skills as a performer or an athlete or an actor, you just say, or an artist, you just say, "Put me to work, America. I'm ready to work hard. Give me a job that I can." You're not going to find a job, and if you find a job, it will not pay you enough to support a family. And as we move in the demographics, this is our future. And so we are increasingly understanding that intellectually. We're not yet willing to put that money in. It is striking to see when you ask people the privacy of their homes, people are more ready today than ever before to say we need to spend more money on education. We've got to provide universal preschool for every child in Houston. Houston is behind Dallas and it's behind San Antonio in the percentage of needy kids who have access to quality preschool education. And it's not just education, it's also all the things that poverty does, the growing separation between rich and poor. That's the great challenge. It's a great challenge for America, and it's a great challenge for Houston. And there's room for some real optimism here because you can see the shifts going on in the general public's understanding of these issues, but very tough. And especially now with the pandemic, Houston has no money, has got increased, sales taxes have gone way down. The challenges of meeting the immediate human needs are so much greater. One answer I think is going to be all of us working to make education better, not just schools, but every business ought to be adopting the school. Every Houstonian who has some free time on his hand ought to be mentoring a child or working in an after-school program. We can do this, but it's not going to happen automatically. One of our great challenges is that during the 1970s, this was the most affluent city in America, and we didn't even do anything to make that happen. It's just our location, the East Texas oil fields. Now, if we're going to succeed to be affluent, it's up to us. It's going to be interesting to see how those attitude changes play out in actual behaviors.
Okay. Very true. Very true.
We're so grateful for the work that you guys are doing. It's such an important piece of the new vision, the new image that people outside Houston are getting now about what's special about Houston. And the bayous are, of course, one of the unique assets and attributes of the city. So Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that comment and for your presentation. Stephen, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much. And with that, everyone, thank all our participants today, our presenters, and everyone who has joined us on the first day of the 2020 Symposium. I know many of you will be seeing us again tomorrow morning, and we have just as diverse a population of speakers, and we'll continue this topic again. Wonderful to have this event pulled off in this setting. And once again, thank everyone for joining us. And that is it for today. We're adjourned.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Thanks, Chris. Great to be with you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Kleinberg.